Across the vast windswept plains and ancient forests of North America, something has always lingered just beyond explanation. Long before written records, before maps were drawn, native peoples spoke of vanishing tribes, cursed grounds, and warnings passed down through generations. Warnings modern science still struggles to explain. What happened to the settlements that disappeared without a trace? Why do certain sites remain untouched, feared even today? Some call it legend. Others call it memory. Tonight, we step into the shadows of history's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. So, sit back, relax, and let's dive in. In the folded, sun-blasted mountains of the American Southwest, where saguaro cast long shadows over canyons few maps ever named accurately, there is a story that refuses to die. It speaks of a hidden settlement, stone walls, perhaps silver veins, perhaps something older still. Built or occupied by a people the earliest Spanish chroniclers called strange, fair-skinned, and unlike their neighbors. They called it, in time, the city of the White Apache. No ruin bearing that name appears on any official register. No excavation has ever produced a cornerstone with its name carved into it. And yet, for over 2 centuries, prospectors, soldiers, missionaries, and wanderers have returned from these mountains with the same unsettling account. A settlement, empty and intact, tucked into a canyon that seemed to close behind them the moment they left, as though the land itself did not want to be found twice. Where does a legend like this begin? The historical record offers fragments, not answers. Spanish expeditions moving north through Sonora and into present-day Arizona in the 1600s and 1700s recorded encounters with Apache bands, and occasionally noted individuals among them with unusually light hair or skin, details often dismissed today as exaggeration, mistranslation, or the ordinary variation found in any population. But the accounts persisted, passed from soldier to settler, from settler to prospector, gathering detail with each retelling. By the 19th century, the White Apache had become shorthand for something more than a physical description, a marker for a lost, half-remembered people said to guard a city no outsider was meant to see. Mainstream historians offer a grounded explanation: isolated communities, captive taking and adoption practices common among many Apache bands, which sometimes incorporated Spanish, Mexican, or other captives fully into the tribe, could easily account for individuals of varied appearance living among them. Mirages and heat distortion in the desert are well documented, capable of transforming ordinary rock formations into the suggestion of walls and towers. And frontier storytelling, layered over decades of gold fever, had every incentive to invent a city worth searching for. But the story does not end there. Speculative accounts, never verified, never entirely dismissed, describe stone structures found and then lost again. Masonry, unlike anything attributed to the region's known cultures, arranged with a precision that seemed deliberate rather than accidental. Some who claimed to have seen it spoke of underground chambers, others of markings on the rock that resembled no known script. A handful never returned from their search at all, and the mountains kept whatever they had found. Is there a rational explanation for every detail? Captive adoption, mirage, myth compounding myth across 200 years of retelling? Almost certainly for most of it. And yet fringe researchers continue to point to the sheer consistency of these accounts, independent witnesses, decades and sometimes a century apart, describing strikingly similar structures in strikingly similar terrain, as something more than coincidence. The mountains have not given up their answer. No expedition has returned with definitive proof, and no historian has fully closed the file. What lies in those unmapped canyons? An empty legend built on heat and hope, or something that was once real and has simply not been found again, remains, for now, an open question. What would it mean if the city was real after all? And what, or who, might still be waiting for it to be found? The mountains keep their secrets in stone and shadow. Along the coast, the secrets are kept differently, in mounds of shell, bleached white and gray, rising quietly from marshland that floods with every tide. There is no need to search for these structures in hidden canyons. They sit in plain sight, some of them a stone's throw from modern parking lots and nature trails. And still, after more than a century of study, no one can say with certainty why they were built. They are called shell rings, and they are among the oldest deliberate constructions in North America. Scattered along the coastlines of present-day South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, these formations are exactly what their name suggests. Massive circular or crescent-shaped accumulations of oyster, clam, and mussel shell, some reaching heights of 10 feet and diameters exceeding 200. The largest, like the ring complex at Fig Island in South Carolina, contain millions of individual shells, the discarded remains, it would seem, of countless meals eaten across generations. Radiocarbon dating places many of these rings between 3,000 and 5,000 years old, built by hunter-gatherer societies that left no written record of their intentions. At first glance, the explanation seems almost too simple. These were, after all, coastal peoples who relied heavily on shellfish. Wouldn't a great mound of discarded shell simply be the byproduct of thousands of meals piled up over centuries in the same convenient location? For decades, this was the leading interpretation, the shell rings dismissed as little more than ancient garbage heaps, or middens, the unremarkable residue of daily survival. But the closer archaeologists looked, the harder that explanation became to sustain. A midden, born of habit and convenience, tends to be irregular. Shapeless piles that grow wherever refuse happen to accumulate. The shell rings of the southeast are not irregular, they are rings. Deliberate, symmetrical, often nearly perfect circles, with a flat, cleared plaza at the center. Open ground, conspicuously free of the debris that surrounds it on every side. Why would a people discarding waste at random consistently produce a geometric shape? Why leave the center untouched, generation after generation, as though something or someone belonged there? Excavations at sites like the Sewee Shell Ring and Rollins Shell Ring on Fort George Island have deepened the puzzle rather than resolved it. Alongside the shells, archaeologists have recovered pottery fragments, tools, and, significantly, human burials, deliberately placed within the mounds. These were not merely refuse piles. They were, at least in part, mortuary spaces, places where the dead were laid to rest within walls built from the remains of 10,000 meals. Layers within the rings also show that construction was not continuous but episodic. Periods of rapid building followed by pauses, followed by renewed activity, sometimes across centuries. This pattern has led many researchers toward a different interpretation entirely, that the rings were built through communal feasting events, seasonal gatherings where dispersed groups came together, consumed shellfish in extraordinary quantity, and left the shells behind not as waste, but as a kind of monument, testimony, layer by layer, that the gathering had happened. If that theory holds, the shell rings become something far more significant than trash heaps. They become among the earliest known evidence of organized, large-scale communal architecture in North America, built by societies once assumed too small, too mobile, and too simply organized to undertake anything of the kind. That alone reshapes what we think we know about the people who lived along these coasts 5,000 years ago. What kind of social structure was required to coordinate a gathering large enough to produce a ring 200 feet across? What ceremony, or authority, or shared belief brought scattered bands together, year after year, to build in this particular shape. And here, the mainstream account begins to brush up against something stranger. Some researchers have noted the acoustic properties of the completed rings. The way sound behaves differently within the enclosed, shell-walled plaza than it does in open ground outside it, with certain frequencies said to carry, echo, or gather near the center in ways that seem, to some ears, deliberately engineered rather than accidental. Was this a byproduct of the shape or a designed feature? A space built in part for sound, for chant, for something meant to be heard collectively within those walls? No consensus exists. Sound archaeology remains a young and contested field, and what feels intentional to one listener may be coincidence to another. Others have pointed to the astronomical alignment of certain openings and plaza orientations within the rings, suggesting a possible relationship to solstice or equinox sightlines. A claim made, with varying degrees of rigor, about ancient sites the world over, and one that invites particular scrutiny here. Are these alignments evidence of careful, calendar-driven design, or the almost inevitable result of drawing enough circles across enough coastline that some, by chance, will point toward the horizon in a meaningful way? The debate continues, largely unresolved, in academic journals few outside the field will ever read. What no one disputes is the age, the scale, and the deliberateness of these rings, nor the fact that the people who built them left no writing to explain themselves, only shell, bone, and the shape of the ground itself. Every meal consumed at that plaza, every body laid to rest within those walls, was a choice, repeated for centuries, by people who understood something about this place that has not survived to reach us. Stand at the center of one of these rings today, quiet, cleared, ringed by the pale remains of 10,000 gatherings, and the question is almost impossible not to ask. What was it, precisely, that once happened here? A feast? A funeral? A ceremony tuned, perhaps, to the sound of the sea and the shape of the circle? Or something else entirely, something the shells themselves were never going to tell us? The ring remains. The reason does not. The sea gives up its mysteries slowly, one grain of sand at a time. Inland, away from tide and shell, the earth itself was reshaped, not by wind or water, but by hands. Deep in the lowest bluffs of southwestern Mississippi, rising from the forest floor like something that does not belong to nature at all, stands a platform of packed earth nearly 8 acres at its base. It is the second largest surviving Native American mound in the United States, and it is called simply Emerald Mound. To stand before it today is to confront a scale that seems almost impossible for its age. The primary platform rises approximately 35 feet, its flattened summit large enough to have once supported multiple structures, with 2 smaller secondary mounds rising further still from that summit. A mound built upon a mound, a hill that was never a hill at all, but a decision, carried out one basket load of earth at a time. Archaeologists estimate the structure required the movement of hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of soil, transported without draft animals, without the wheel, without metal tools, carried, almost certainly, in woven baskets, on human backs, across generations. Construction is generally dated to between roughly 1300 and 1600, built and used by the ancestors of the Natchez people, part of the broader Mississippian cultural tradition that once produced monumental earthworks across much of the American Southeast and Midwest. On this, mainstream archaeology is largely settled. This was a ceremonial and civic center, likely the residence of ranking elites and the site of religious ritual, ceremony, and gathering, a seat of authority for a complex, stratified society that predates sustained European contact by centuries. When French colonists encountered the Natchez in the early 1700s, they documented a rigid, ceremonially rich social order centered on a ruler known as the Great Sun, whose position was bound to sacred mound-based authority. Emerald Mound, many researchers believe, may represent an earlier chapter of that same tradition, a capital before the capital the French would later record. And yet, for all that is known, the mound resists easy explanation the moment you begin asking why. Why this location, a bluff above a creek, when other sites in the region offered easier access to water and trade? Why this particular scale, so far beyond what ceremonial necessity alone would seem to require? Construction on this scale demands not just labor, but coordination, a workforce organized, fed, and directed over years, possibly decades. What kind of authority commands that? What belief system convinces thousands of people that reshaping a hillside is not merely useful, but necessary? The mainstream answer points to religion and cosmology. Mississippian earthworks across the region are widely understood to reflect a symbolic worldview: mounds as artificial mountains, platforms elevating the sacred and the powerful closer to the sky, plazas below serving as stages for ritual and public life. Under this view, Emerald Mound's scale is not mysterious so much as it is a message, a declaration of the authority, wealth, and spiritual centrality of whoever stood atop it. The bigger the mound, the louder the statement. But there are details that sit less comfortably within that explanation. Unlike many Mississippian sites, Emerald Mound appears to have been used relatively briefly before it was abandoned, its ceremonial life apparently winding down well before European contact, for reasons that remain unclear. Was it disease, arriving ahead of the colonists themselves, moving invisibly through trade networks decades before any European set foot in the region? Was it drought, conflict, or a shift in political power that moved authority elsewhere? The archaeological record shows the decline, but not, with any certainty, its cause. A civilization center of gravity quietly relocating, and no one left behind to explain why. Then there is the matter of what, precisely, once stood on the summit. Post holes and architectural traces suggest temple structures and elite residences, but their full form, their appearance, their specific function can only be inferred, never fully reconstructed. Early accounts from French chroniclers describing later Natchez practice, a ceremonial order fixated on the sun, on rigid ritual purity, on structures of power so absolute they governed matters of life and death, offer tantalizing, if imperfect, clues. Were these practices a continuation of what happened at Emerald Mound centuries earlier, largely unchanged? Or had the intervening years transformed the tradition into something its original builders would barely recognize? Oral histories, carried forward by descendant communities, preserve fragments of memory that written colonial records never captured. But fragments are, by their nature, incomplete, and much may have been lost in the space between what was practiced and what was ever written down. More speculative voices have gone further still, pointing to the mound's precise orientation and asking whether its alignment reflects deliberate astronomical calculation. A summit positioned to track solstice light across the plaza below, in a manner echoing claims made about mound sites elsewhere on the continent. As with those other sites, the evidence remains suggestive rather than conclusive, argued over by researchers who agree on little beyond the fact that the question has not been closed. What remains beyond dispute is the mound itself, silent, immense, and deliberate, a monument built by a society whose name for it we do not know, for purposes we can only partially reconstruct. Every basket load of earth carried up that bluff was an act of will, repeated by hundreds of hands over years none of us witnessed. Somewhere beneath the packed soil of Emerald Mound, encoded in a language of dirt and elevation rather than words, is the answer to why it was built at all. The platform still stands. The purpose, in its fullest sense, has yet to be recovered. Not every mystery is carved from stone or piled from shell. Some are woven from distance itself. The strange, unexplained fact of two civilizations, separated by hundreds of miles of unforgiving desert, that somehow spoke to one another for centuries before falling silent together. In the arid basin of northern Chihuahua, Mexico, the ruins of Paquime, better known as Casas Grandes, rise from the desert floor in the eroded remains of multi-story adobe structures, ball courts, and platform mounds. 400 miles to the northwest, across some of the harshest terrain on the continent, the canals and platform mounds of the Hohokam once irrigated the Arizona desert into something close to farmland. Two civilizations, one vast empty distance between them, and a body of evidence suggesting they were never as separate as that distance implies. Casas Grandes reached its height between roughly 1200 and 1450, a period during which it grew into one of the largest and most sophisticated settlements in the region. A trade hub with multi-story buildings, sophisticated water and sewage systems, and evidence of macaw breeding on an industrial scale, alongside ball courts nearly identical in form to those built far to the south in Mesoamerica. The Hohokam, meanwhile, had already been thriving in the Arizona desert for centuries by this point, engineering an extraordinary network of irrigation canals, some stretching over 10 miles, that transformed the Sonoran Desert into productive farmland long before European contact. On the surface, these look like two unrelated success stories, each adapted to its own environment. But archaeologists have long noted an unmistakable pattern of shared material culture linking the two. Nearly identical ball court designs, strikingly similar platform mound architecture, shared pottery motifs, and, most tellingly, matching trade goods moving in both directions. Marine shell from the Gulf of California, worked into ornaments, has been recovered at Casas Grandes far from any coastline. Turquoise, copper bells cast in Mesoamerican styles, and scarlet macaws, birds native to the tropical regions far to the south, requiring careful, specialized breeding to survive and reproduce this far from their natural range. All point toward a trade and cultural network stretching from central Mexico through Casas Grandes and up into the Hohokam world of the American Southwest. Mainstream archaeology frames this as compelling, if still incompletely understood, evidence of a genuine, long-distance exchange network. Ideas, goods, and possibly people moving along established routes across a landscape most modern observers would consider impassable to sustained trade. Under this view, Casas Grandes functioned as a kind of gateway city, a hub where Mesoamerican influence filtered northward and southwestern goods flowed south, refashioning both cultures in the exchange. It is, by most measures, a satisfying answer. Deserts have never truly stopped human movement. They have only shaped its routes. But the deeper question is not whether contact happened. Most researchers now accept that it did, in some form. The deeper question is how coordinated, how deliberate, and how far it truly extended. Was this loose, informal trade, passed hand to hand between neighboring communities over generations, each link in the chain unaware of how far the goods it handled would ultimately travel? Or does the consistency of the architecture, ball courts built to matching specifications hundreds of miles apart, platform mounds sharing construction techniques, suggest something closer to direct contact, shared builders, or a common tradition deliberately transmitted rather than passively diffused? The macaws alone raise the question sharply. Breeding tropical birds this far outside their range required knowledge, infrastructure, and sustained effort. Who carried that knowledge north, and why did it matter enough to make the journey? Then comes the harder question, the one that gives this mystery its edge. Why did both civilizations decline within a similar window of time? roughly across the 1400s, in the decades before sustained European contact reached the region at all. Casas Grandes was largely abandoned by the early 1500s, its great structures left to the desert. The Hohokam canal systems fell silent around the same era, their vast irrigation networks abandoned by populations that dispersed into smaller, less centralized communities. Mainstream explanations point to drought, resource depletion, and internal social stress. Plausible, evidence-supported causes that required no connection between the two collapses at all. Coincidence, on a long enough timeline, is not so improbable. And yet the timing invites the question anyway. If these two civilizations were bound together by an exchange network sophisticated enough to move breeding macaws and matching architectural traditions across 400 miles of desert, could the collapse of one have destabilized the other? A trade partner's disappearance removing not just goods, but the social and economic scaffolding that had helped sustain a wider network. Some researchers have raised this possibility cautiously. Others regard it as reading connection into what may simply be two societies responding, independently, to the same regional climate pressures. The evidence so far supports no firm conclusion in either direction. What survives is the physical record of contact itself. Shell from a distant gulf, birds bred far from their native range, ball courts echoing one another across an impossible distance, evidence of two peoples who found a way to reach each other across a desert that should, by every practical measure, have kept them apart. Whether that connection was the thread that bound their fates together in decline, or merely a coincidence of timing across two unrelated stories, remains an open question, buried somewhere in the space between Chihuahua and Arizona that neither trade goods nor archaeology has yet fully closed. What exactly traveled along that route besides shell and turquoise and macaw feathers, and what might have traveled back the other way, unrecorded, when the network finally went quiet? Some mysteries are etched into monuments too vast to overlook. Others are almost the opposite. Small, scattered, unassuming rings of stone that most travelers walk past without a second glance, tucked into hillsides where the wind never seems to stop moving. Across the high, arid plateau carved by the Columbia and Snake Rivers, a landscape of basalt cliffs, rolling grassland, and river canyons spanning eastern Washington, Oregon, and parts of Idaho, hundreds of these formations survive today. Low circles of stacked or arranged stone, rarely more than knee-high, ranging from a few feet across to structures large enough to enclose a small dwelling. They are unassuming by design, perhaps, and they may be among the least understood ceremonial structures in North America. Unlike the towering mounds of the southeast or the sprawling adobe complex of Casas Grandes, the stone circles of the Columbia Plateau were never meant to announce themselves from a distance. Most sit on ridgelines, bluffs, and isolated hilltops. Locations chosen, it seems, for solitude rather than visibility. Ethnographic accounts gathered from Plateau peoples, including the Nez Perce, Yakima, and Sandpoil, along with early 20th century anthropological fieldwork, connect many of these structures to a practice widely documented across the region, the vision quest. Adolescents, typically on the threshold of adulthood, would travel alone to isolated high ground, fast, and remain in solitary vigil for days at a time, seeking a guiding vision or spiritual power meant to shape the course of their life. The stone rings, by this account, mark the physical space of that solitude, a boundary built by hand, then left standing long after the vigil ended, sometimes reused by later individuals seeking the same isolation, the same ground once offered. It is, on its face, a coherent and well-supported explanation, grounded in living oral tradition rather than speculation. And for many of these circles, it likely accounts for exactly what we see. But the closer researchers have looked at the full distribution of these structures, the more the picture complicates. Not all the circles fit neatly into the Vision Quest model. Some are found in clusters rather than isolation, dozens of rings arranged across a single ridge, spaced with what appears to be deliberate regularity, in locations that would have offered little of the solitude the Vision Quest tradition seems to require. Others are considerably larger than a single person would need, their interior space suggesting groups rather than solitary vigil, and a smaller number show alignments, entrances, gaps, or elongated axes that some researchers have proposed may correspond to sunrise or sunset positions on the horizon at particular times of year, raising the question of whether at least some of these structures served an observational, calendrical function alongside, or instead of, a purely spiritual one. Why would a single architectural form, repeated across such a wide territory, serve such apparently different purposes? One possibility, favored by many archaeologists, is simply that it didn't, that stone circle is too broad a category, lumping together structures built by different peoples, in different eras, for genuinely different reasons, unified only by the fact that stacked, unmortared stone survives well in an arid climate long after its builders and their intentions have been forgotten. Dating these structures precisely is notoriously difficult. Stone does not carbon date the way organic material does, and many circles have never been securely tied to a specific century, let alone a specific purpose. It is entirely possible that what we now group together as one phenomenon is, in truth, several centuries and several distinct traditions collapsed into a single, tidy label by observers who came generations after the fact. But there is a further layer to this mystery, one that resists easy resolution. Several of the larger and more remote stone circle sites on the plateau show evidence of having been deliberately dismantled or partially destroyed. Stones scattered outward from a once intact ring, in patterns that some researchers argue look less like erosion or animal disturbance and more like intentional demolition. Why would a structure, built with evident care and apparently sacred purpose, later be deliberately taken apart? Was it a ritual act of closure? A formal end to a site's spiritual function once it had served its purpose? Was it a response to trauma, the disruption of tradition and displacement that swept through plateau communities, following contact, disease, and forced relocation, a severing of practice too painful to leave standing? Or does it point to something else entirely, a conflict or taboo attached to specific sites that oral tradition no longer fully preserves? The people whose ancestors built these circles carry fragments of this knowledge still, but colonization fractured the transmission of exactly this kind of detailed, place-specific memory, and what survives in the historical and ethnographic record is, by every honest account, incomplete. More speculative voices have gone further, pointing to the handful of circles with apparent solar alignment and asking whether the plateau's stone rings represent a genuinely older observational tradition, one predating or running parallel to their better documented use in Vision Quest practice, evidence of astronomical knowledge among plateau peoples that has not yet been fully reconstructed or credited. As with similar claims elsewhere on the continent, the alignments are real enough to warrant study, and contested enough that no consensus has formed around what, if anything, they were built to track. What remains, scattered across ridgelines and bluffs from the Columbia to the Snake, are hundreds of quiet, unassuming rings of stone, some clearly linked to a living tradition of solitary vision, others resisting that explanation entirely, and a handful showing signs of having been deliberately, purposefully undone. Each one was built for a reason its builders understood completely and recorded nowhere but in stone and memory. How many distinct purposes are hidden within a single, deceptively simple architectural form? And how much of that purpose was lost not to time alone, but to the deliberate breaking of the very stones meant to preserve it? There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room built to hold many voices at once, and finds, instead, that it has been empty for 800 years. In the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, along the banks of the Animas River, sits a sandstone complex whose name is, itself, a small mystery of misattribution. Early American settlers, encountering its scale and sophistication in the 19th century, assumed, incorrectly, that only the Aztec Empire of central Mexico could have built something so ambitious this far north. The name stuck. The people who actually built it were not Aztec at all, but ancestral Puebloans, and the structure they left behind, known today as Aztec ruins, remains one of the most quietly perplexing sights in the American Southwest. At the heart of the complex stands the Great Kiva, a large, circular, partially subterranean ceremonial chamber, reconstructed in the 1930s to give visitors a sense of what the space once was. But it is not the reconstruction that troubles archaeologists. It is what lies beneath and around it. Dozens of smaller kivas, some fully excavated, many still buried, scattered throughout the site in a density that raises an immediate question. Why so many? A single great kiva, built to accommodate large communal ceremony, is consistent with what researchers understand of Puebloan spiritual life. But Aztec ruins contains kiva upon kiva, layered and repeated across generations of construction, in a pattern that suggests something more complicated than a single community simply gathering to worship in one place. The mainstream understanding, built from decades of careful excavation, situates Aztec ruins within the broader story of Chacoan influence. Constructed beginning around 1100, the complex shares clear architectural DNA with Chaco Canyon, roughly 55 miles to the south, precise masonry, aligned great houses, and ceremonial kivas built to the same exacting standards that defined Chacoan society at its height. Many archaeologists now believe Aztec ruins functioned as a kind of successor community, rising in prominence as Chaco Canyon itself entered decline, perhaps absorbing displaced population, ceremonial authority, or both. Under this view, the site's many kivas simply reflect centuries of continuous use, rebuilding, and expansion, successive generations layering new ceremonial space atop the old, as populations grew, moved, and reorganized their spiritual life across nearly 200 years of occupation. It is a reasonable, well-evidenced framework, and yet the details recovered during excavation resist total tidiness. Tree ring dating of roof timbers has allowed researchers to establish construction sequences with unusual precision, and what that timeline reveals is not smooth, gradual growth, but distinct, sometimes abrupt phases, periods of intensive building followed by apparent pauses, followed by renewed construction that, in some cases, deliberately buried or sealed off earlier kivas entirely, rather than simply building beside them. Why bury a functioning ceremonial space rather than continuing to use it? Was this an act of ritual closure, a formal retirement of sacred space once its purpose had been fulfilled? A practice with parallels elsewhere in Puebloan tradition, where structures are known to have been intentionally decommissioned? Or does it point to something more disruptive? A shift in religious authority, a change in who held ceremonial power, urgent enough to justify sealing away the spaces associated with what came before. The most debated evidence comes from within the kivas themselves. Excavators have recovered offerings, ceremonial deposits, and in certain instances, human remains interred with apparent care beneath kiva floors, practices consistent with sacred, intentional ritual, though their precise meaning is far harder to reconstruct than their physical presence. What ceremony required a burial beneath the floor of a room built for gathering the living? Was this an honoring of ancestors meant to anchor the space spiritually, binding a structure to a lineage or a specific act of devotion? Pueblo and oral tradition, carried forward by descendant communities including the Hopi and several Pueblo nations, holds knowledge that connects to these practices. But that knowledge is held carefully, and much of it is not, and was never meant to be, shared with outside researchers. What survives in the academic record is therefore necessarily partial. Physical evidence of intention, without full access to the meaning behind it. Then there is the broader, still unresolved question of decline. Like Chaco before it, and Casas Grandes far to the south, occupation at Aztec ruins appears to have wound down by the 1300s, part of a wider pattern of movement and reorganization across the ancestral Puebloan world during this era, a period marked by sustained drought and shifting social conditions that reshaped settlement across the entire Southwest. The great Kivas fell silent. The site was not violently destroyed, nor does it show clear evidence of catastrophe. It appears, instead, to have been deliberately, carefully left, swept, closed, and abandoned rather than fled. What does it mean to leave a sacred structure with such apparent intention rather than in crisis? What was owed to a space like that, in the minds of the people walking away from it for the last time? More speculative researchers have pointed to the sheer number of buried, still unexcavated kivas across the wider site. The majority of the complex, by some estimates, remains beneath the earth, unexplored, and asked what else might be sealed within chambers no one has opened in 8 centuries. Undisturbed offerings, additional burials, evidence that might sharpen or complicate the picture built so far. For now, that question remains exactly that, a question, resting quietly beneath New Mexico soil, in rooms built to hold ceremony and voices that have not been heard in 800 years. How many more kivas lie sealed beneath that ground? And what precisely were they built to hold in or keep out when the last hands closed them for good? Every buried chamber holds its silence alone. But some mysteries are not about a single site at all. They are about the empty spaces between sites, the villages that once linked one great center to another, and then, one by one, went quiet. Across the floodplain of the Mississippi River, near present-day St. Louis, rises the largest earthen structure north of Mexico. Monk's Mound, the ceremonial heart of a city called Cahokia, once home to an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 people at its height around 1100, a population that would not be matched again within the borders of the present-day United States for centuries. Cahokia did not exist in isolation. It sat at the center of an extraordinary web of exchange, evidenced by objects recovered from its mounds and residential areas. Copper from the shores of Lake Superior, more than 800 miles to the north. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast, worked into ornaments and ceremonial regalia. Mica sheets from the southern Appalachians. And galena, a lead ore prized for its silvery pigment, sourced from deposits scattered across the greater Midwest. None of these materials occurred naturally near Cahokia itself. Every piece had traveled, carried hand to hand, community to community, along river routes and overland paths that connected the city to a continent's worth of smaller settlements, villages whose names, if they had names at all beyond what their own people called them, did not survive into the written record. This is where the mystery begins to take shape. Archaeologists have mapped dozens of secondary mound sites and satellite communities scattered across the greater Cahokia region and beyond, evidently tied into this network as waypoints, production centers, or ceremonial outposts of their own. Yet many of these villages show a troubling pattern: periods of clear, active occupation, followed by comparatively abrupt abandonment, often well before Cahokia's own decline began in earnest. Why would the smaller nodes of a thriving trade network fail while the center they served remained active? A resilient system, one might expect, would show its satellite communities weakening gradually, in step with the hub they depended on. Instead, the evidence suggests something closer to a slow unraveling from the edges inward, outlying villages going silent first, one after another, while Cahokia itself persisted for a time as an increasingly isolated center of a network that had once stretched for hundreds of miles. Mainstream explanations offer several converging pressures. Climatic instability, including a documented period of prolonged drought and flooding cycles along the Mississippi during the 1100s and 1200s, would have disrupted the agricultural surplus that sustained both Cahokia and the trade partners feeding it. Deforestation around the city itself, driven by the sheer scale of construction and fuel demands of a population in the tens of thousands, may have destabilized local ecology in ways that rippled outward. And there is growing evidence of social and political stress within Cahokia in its final century. A defensive palisade wall constructed and rebuilt multiple times around the city's ceremonial core, suggesting rising tension or conflict, whether internal, external, or both. Any of these pressures, compounding across generations, could account for a network unraveling village by village. But archaeologists studying the wider trade region have noted something harder to explain through environmental stress alone. The disappearance is not uniform. Some outlying communities, particularly those tied most closely to the movement of specific prestige goods like long-nosed god mesquits, small, distinctive effigy ornaments found scattered across an enormous range from Oklahoma to Wisconsin to the Gulf Coast, seem to vanish from the archaeological record in a pattern that roughly traces the reach of Cahokian religious and political influence itself, almost as though the network's ideological core, not merely its economy, was what held these distant villages together. When that core weakened, did the villages lose not just their trading partner but the belief system that had bound them into the network in the first place? Was Cahokia's influence less a matter of goods changing hands and more a shared cosmology, a common ceremonial language spreading along the same rivers that carried copper and shell, one that could not survive once the center that sustained it began to falter? There is a further layer that has drawn considerable debate. Several outlying sites tied to the Cahokian network show evidence of sudden, deliberate closure rather than slow attrition. Structures burned in what appears to be a controlled, ritual manner rather than accidental fire or conflict, mirroring practices of intentional decommissioning documented at other Mississippian and Puebloan sites elsewhere on the continent. Were these villages formally, ceremonially ended by their own inhabitants, a deliberate closing of a chapter rather than a collapse forced upon them? Or does the burning point to something more urgent? Communities destroying what they could not carry, ahead of departure driven by threat, disease, or desperation. The two possibilities, ritual and crisis, are not easily distinguished in the archaeological record, and both remain seriously considered. By the time Cahokia itself was largely abandoned, sometime in the 1300s, the network of villages that had once sustained it across hundreds of miles had already gone quiet for generations in many directions, a slow contraction that scholars are still working to map fully, satellite site by satellite site, trade good by trade good. What compels a network spanning a third of a continent to unravel from its edges inward, while its center endures a while longer, alone? And what happened in those final ceremonies or final fires, in villages whose names we will likely never recover, the last moments of communities that had spent generations helping build one of the greatest cities North America had ever seen? Not every mystery announces itself through scale or silence. Some are small enough to hold in one hand. A shard of pottery, its surface catching the light in a way that ceramics from the same region, made only a generation earlier, never could. At Pecos Pueblo, in the pinon-covered hills of northern New Mexico, where the Great Plains meet the edge of the Rio Grande Valley, archaeologists have spent nearly a century puzzling over exactly that shift, the sudden, and still not fully explained, appearance of glaze-painted pottery among the ancestral Puebloan communities of the region, sometime around the late 1300s. Before this period, Puebloan potters across the Rio Grande Valley worked almost exclusively in matte mineral and organic paints, producing the black-on-white and polychrome wares long associated with the Southwest. Then, within a relatively narrow window of time, a new technique appears in the archaeological record: a lead-bearing glaze paint, applied to pottery and fired in a way that caused the decoration to melt into a glossy, glass-like finish. A genuine technological leap, requiring precise control of kiln temperature and an understanding of lead ore chemistry that has no clear, gradual developmental sequence leading up to it in the local record. One century, potters are working in matte pigment. The next, glaze technology appears already sophisticated, already widely practiced at sites across a broad swath of the Rio Grande region, with Pecos Pueblo emerging as one of its most prolific production centers. This abruptness is, in itself, the heart of the mystery. Technological innovation in pre-contact Puebloan ceramics elsewhere in the Southwest tends to show incremental development. Earlier, cruder versions of a technique giving way, over generations, to refined mastery, with intermediate stages preserved in the archaeological sequence. Glaze ware does not follow this pattern cleanly. Excavations have struggled to identify a clear local experimental phase, the expected trail of early attempts and failures that would normally precede a technology this demanding. Where, then, did the knowledge come from? And why does it appear to arrive already fully formed? Mainstream archaeology offers a reasonably grounded answer, rooted in the broader context of regional trade and contact. Lead glaze technology was known elsewhere in Mesoamerica and had a documented, if geographically distant, history of use in decorative and ceremonial objects to the south. The Rio Grande Valley in the 14th century sat within an active exchange network reaching toward the Casas Grande trade sphere and beyond. The same broad web of contact discussed earlier in this exploration that carried macaws, shell, and shared architectural ideas across hundreds of miles of desert. Under this framework, glaze technology may simply represent knowledge transmitted along an established trade route, carried by a traveling potter, a captured or adopted individual, or simply an idea passed between communities already in regular contact, a technique absorbed quickly precisely because the social and economic networks needed to spread it were already firmly in place. It is a coherent explanation and likely accounts for much of what happened, but it does not fully resolve why the adoption was so rapid, nor why Pecos and its neighboring communities pursued glaze technology with such intensity once it arrived, dramatically reorganizing craft production and trade around it within a few generations. Glaze ware quickly became one of the most widely traded ceramic types in the pre-contact Southwest, moving along exchange networks stretching from the Rio Grande to the Hopi mesas and beyond. What made this particular technique so immediately, overwhelmingly desirable, more than a novel aesthetic worth reorganizing regional production around? Was it purely visual, the glassy shine offering something matte pigment never could? Or did the glaze carry symbolic weight beyond decoration, a material association with distant, prestigious trade partners to the south, its glossy surface functioning less as decoration and more as a kind of visible signal of connection to a wider, more cosmopolitan world? There is a further complication that has drawn sustained academic attention. The lead ore required for the glaze was not uniformly available across the region, meaning specific communities, Pecos prominent among them, appear to have controlled key portions of the supply chain, sourcing, processing, and likely trading raw glaze material to potters elsewhere who lacked direct access. This transforms the story from a simple case of technological diffusion into something closer to an economic and political one. Did control over glaze material become a source of real influence and wealth for the communities that held it? Did access to this single technical innovation reshape the balance of power among Rio Grande pueblos in the century before European contact, elevating certain communities and leaving others dependent on trade to participate in what had quickly become one of the region's most valued ceramic traditions? Some researchers have pushed the question further still, noting that lead glaze paint, for all its visual appeal, was also more technically demanding and less durable in daily use than the traditional matte wares it partially displaced. Glaze ware is more prone to flaking and wear under regular handling. Why would potters across an entire region invest so heavily in a technique that was, by some practical measures, inferior to what it replaced? Was the appeal purely aesthetic and social, worth the trade-off in durability? Or does this apparent inefficiency hint at a use pattern we don't yet fully understand? Glazeware produced less for everyday function and more for trade, display, or ceremony. Its impracticality beside the point entirely? What remains, cataloged in museum drawers, and still emerging from excavation units at Pecos and across the Rio Grande Valley, are thousands of fragments bearing witness to a technology that arrived quickly, spread further, and reorganized craft and trade across an entire region, all without leaving behind a clear account of exactly how or why it began. Somewhere in that gap between the last matte vessel and the first glazed one lies a story of contact, knowledge, and ambition that the shards themselves have only partially told. What else, carried quietly along the same routes that brought this glassy shine to the Rio Grande, has yet to surface from the ground? A single fragment of pottery can hold a mystery in the palm of a hand. A landscape holds its mysteries differently, spread across miles, visible only from above, or only at the precise moment the low desert sun throws a shadow across ground that looks at any other hour like nothing at all. In the Mojave Desert, across the arid basins and volcanic mesas of southeastern California, one such landscape endures. Hundreds of large-scale ground figures and rock alignments, etched and arranged across the desert pavement, some stretching more than half a mile in length, many invisible at eye level and legible only from elevation. These are the Mojave's intaglios and rock alignments, a category of desert art and construction distinct from, though occasionally compared to, the far more famous Nazca lines of South America. Unlike the Nazca figures, cut into desert soil through a technique of surface removal, many of the Mojave alignments were built by a different, subtler method, gathering and arranging the dark, sun-varnished stones that cover much of the desert floor, either clearing them away to expose lighter ground beneath in deliberate patterns, or piling them into low rock alignments, cairns, and geometric forms that trace lines across the landscape, sometimes for hundreds of feet at a stretch. The most famous examples near Blythe, California, depict enormous anthropomorphic and animal figures, a human form stretching over 100 feet, accompanied by figures resembling four-legged animals, visible in full only from the air, a perspective their builders, working entirely at ground level, could never have shared. Radiocarbon and other dating methods applied to associated materials suggest these figures and alignments span an extraordinary range of time, with some evidence pointing to construction beginning well over 1,000 years ago and continuing, in various forms, into the more recent past. Ethnographic accounts from Mojave, Chacoan, and other Colorado River peoples connect at least some of these ground figures to origin narratives and ceremonial practice. Ground drawings associated with the mythological figure of Mastamho, a creator being central to regional oral tradition. with the human and animal forms interpreted as depictions tied directly to these stories. Under this framework, the intaglios are neither purely decorative nor purely mysterious. They are sacred narrative, rendered in stone and cleared earth, meant to be understood by a community that already carried the story the ground was illustrating. This is, by most scholarly accounts, the best supported explanation available, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Unlike many of the mysteries explored so far in this series, the Mojave's ground figures are not orphaned from the people who might explain them. Descendant communities along the Colorado River maintain living connections to this tradition and to the land itself. And yet, even within that framework, open questions remain, precisely because so much of what these figures meant was never intended for outside eyes at all, let alone for a perspective only achievable from the air. That aerial visibility is, in fact, where the deeper puzzle begins. Why construct an image at a scale that only reveals its full form from a vantage point no one on the ground could reach? Some researchers propose the figures were never meant to be viewed as a complete image at all, that their significance lay in the act of walking their outline, tracing the figure on foot as a ceremonial path, ritual, procession, or ceremonial reenactment of the story being depicted, with the view belonging to participation rather than sight. This reframes the mystery entirely. Perhaps the question is not how anyone saw the whole figure, but why an entire, perfectly proportioned figure was necessary if no one ever would. Beyond the great figures themselves lies a second, less publicized layer of the mystery. The desert's smaller rock alignments, straight lines, geometric shapes, and cairn formations that number in the hundreds across the wider Mojave and lower Colorado River region, many without any clear representational form at all. Some appear to connect trail systems, potentially marking travel routes across a landscape with few reliable natural landmarks. Others align, according to several independent surveys, with solstice or equinox positions on the horizon, an observation that, as with similar claims examined elsewhere in this series, invites real scrutiny rather than either automatic acceptance or dismissal. Are these lines a form of practical, calendrical marking, tracking planting or ceremonial timing across a landscape where seasonal precision could matter enormously for survival? Or does their abundance and variety suggest multiple purposes, layered across different eras and different builders, now flattened by time into a single, deceptively uniform category? There is, too, the matter of preservation, and what it may be quietly telling us. Desert pavement, the dark, varnished stone surface that makes these alignments visible at all, forms exceedingly slowly, undisturbed for centuries or millennia in the Mojave's dry stillness. Every cleared line, every stone moved from its resting place to build these figures remains almost exactly as its builders left it, largely undisturbed by weather, vegetation, or erosion, in a way that would have long since erased a similar structure in a wetter climate. This means the Mojave may hold undiscovered alignments still, subtle, low-contrast patterns invisible from the ground, never yet identified from above, waiting only for the right season, the right sun angle, or the right eye-scanning satellite imagery to notice a shape that has lain exposed and unrecognized for 1,000 years. What survives across this stretch of desert, then, is not a single mystery but a layered one, a sacred tradition partly explained by the very communities descended from its makers and partly still unread, embedded in lines and figures whose full purpose may have always belonged to participation rather than observation. How many more of these quiet, ground-level messages remain scattered across the Mojave's dark stone, visible only from an angle no one has yet thought to look from? Some messages are meant to be walked. Others were meant to be seen only in flickering torchlight, deep within limestone shelters where the desert sun never reaches at all. Where the Pecos and Devils Rivers cut through the arid canyonlands of southwest Texas before meeting the Rio Grande, hundreds of rock shelters line the cliff faces, their walls covered in some of the oldest, most elaborate, and least understood mural art in North America. This is the lower Pecos Canyonlands, home to a body of rock art so distinctive it has its own name in the archaeological literature, the Pecos River style. Painted primarily in black, red, yellow, and white pigment derived from mineral ochres and charcoal, the murals stretch across shelter walls in compositions that can run 20, 30, sometimes over 40 feet in length. Towering anthropomorphic figures, some exceeding 10 feet in height, rendered alongside deer, cats, birds, and abstract geometric forms, layered and overlapping in ways that suggest the same walls were returned to and repainted across many generations. Radiocarbon dating of pigment samples, along with associated organic material, has pushed the age of some of these murals back an extraordinary distance. Current estimates place the oldest layers at roughly 4,000 years old, with some researchers arguing for dates considerably older still, making this among the longest continuously maintained rock art traditions anywhere on the continent. The scale alone raises an immediate question. What did it take to produce a single mural of this size on a shelter wall accessible only by climbing rope or precarious foothold, using pigments that in some cases had to be sourced, ground, and mixed from minerals not locally available? This was not casual or spontaneous work. It required planning, sustained labor, and, given the height and complexity of the compositions, very likely a form of scaffolding, along with an artist or group of artists, operating with clear intention across what may have been days or weeks of continuous effort. Mainstream archaeology situates the Pecos River style within a broader interpretive framework grounded in shamanic and cosmological practice, drawn partly from comparative ethnography of hunter-gatherer societies elsewhere and partly from the internal visual logic of the panels themselves. The towering anthropomorphic figures, often depicted with elaborate headdresses, radiating lines, and staff-like objects held in raised hands, are widely interpreted as shamanic figures, possibly depicted mid-ritual, mid-transformation, or in an altered state associated with religious practice. Some researchers have pointed to visual elements within the murals that echo entoptic imagery, geometric patterns associated cross-culturally with trance states, as supporting evidence for a ceremonial, possibly psychoactive dimension to the tradition, particularly given the documented presence of substances like peyote within the broader region's later ethnographic record. Under this reading, the shelters functioned not as habitation sites primarily, but as sacred spaces, returned to across centuries for ritual practice that left its record layered directly onto the rock. This explanation accounts for a great deal, but it does not fully resolve the deeper puzzle of the mural's content. Certain recurring figures within the Pecos River style depict beings that resist straightforward classification. Composite forms blending human and animal characteristics in ways that go beyond simple costume or ritual regalia. Alongside a small number of enigmatic figures, some researchers have linked, cautiously, to feathered serpent iconography more commonly associated with cultures far to the south in Mesoamerica, raising unresolved questions about the reach and timing of shared symbolic vocabulary across the pre-contact Americas. Are these coincidental convergences arising independently from the shared human tendency to depict serpents as powerful or sacred? Or do they suggest contact, however indirect, between distant, seemingly unconnected traditions, carried the same distances covered by the trade networks explored earlier in this series? There is also the matter of superimposition, the deliberate layering of newer paintings directly atop older ones, sometimes obscuring earlier work almost entirely, sometimes leaving both old and new partially visible in a single, densely composed panel. Why paint over sacred imagery rather than beginning fresh on an untouched section of wall when so much shelter surface across the Canyonlands remained available? Was earlier work considered spent, its ceremonial power expended and requiring renewal through deliberate replacement? Was the act of painting over older figures itself part of the ritual, a dialogue conducted across generations, each artist responding directly to the work of those who had painted the same wall centuries before? The murals preserve the fact of this layering with total clarity. They do not preserve the reasoning behind it. Perhaps the most persistent unresolved question concerns continuity and rupture. The Pecos River style appears to have been sustained, with recognizable stylistic consistency, across an extraordinary span of possibly 2,000 years or more. A tradition maintained by a hunter-gatherer population without the kind of centralized authority typically associated with preserving such precise conventions over so many centuries. How does an artistic and ceremonial tradition remain this coherent across dozens, perhaps hundreds, of generations, transmitted apparently through practice and observation alone, with no writing system to anchor its rules? And then, at some point before sustained European contact, the style appears to end. Later, rock art in the region shifts to markedly different styles and techniques, the elaborate Pecos River murals no longer produced. What broke that chain of transmission? Population decline, migration, a shift in belief that rendered the old imagery obsolete, or some disruption the archaeological record has not yet identified? What remains, hidden within limestone shelters along rivers that still carry the same names given to them centuries later, are murals that have outlasted their makers by thousands of years without surrendering the full weight of what they meant. Every repainted wall, every towering shamanic figure raising a staff toward the shelter ceiling, is a fragment of a conversation conducted across an almost unimaginable span of time, one side of which we can still see clearly, and the other side of which has gone entirely silent. What was the first mark ever made on these walls meant to say, and to whom, 4,000 years before anyone thought to ask? A mural can hold a conversation across 2,000 years within the space of a single shelter wall. A road holds its conversation differently, stretched out across the land itself, engineered with a precision that seems, at first glance, to serve no one at all. From the air, cutting arrow straight across the sagebrush flats and mesa tops of northwestern New Mexico, faint linear scars are still visible today, running for miles in directions that rarely bend to follow the natural contour of the terrain. These are the remnants of what archaeologists now call the Chaco Road System, one of the most ambitious engineering achievements in pre-contact North America, and one of its most persistently unresolved questions. Chaco Canyon, occupied and expanded between roughly 850 and 1150, was the ceremonial and political heart of a network of great houses, massive, multi-story masonry complexes, built with an architectural precision unmatched elsewhere in the region at the time. Pueblo Bonito alone, the largest of these structures, contained an estimated 600 rooms across 4 or 5 stories, oriented with careful attention to solar and lunar alignment. But Chaco Canyon did not stand alone. Beginning in the early 20th century and accelerating dramatically with the advent of aerial photography and later satellite and LiDAR imaging, researchers began mapping a network of formal roads radiating outward from the canyon, connecting it to dozens of outlying great houses scattered across an area encompassing much of the San Juan Basin, sites as far as Aztec ruins, discussed earlier in this exploration and beyond, some more than 50 miles distant. What makes these roads remarkable is not merely their existence, but their construction. Unlike the informal trails that footpaths naturally wear into a landscape over time, the Chaco roads were deliberately engineered, cleared of vegetation and surface stone to a consistent width, often 30 feet across, sometimes bordered by low earthen berms or masonry curbs, and cut directly through obstacles rather than routed around them. Where a road met a cliff face or a steep mesa edge, Chacoan builders frequently carved stairways directly into the rock, rather than diverting the path along an easier grade. This is, on its face, the signature of a society investing enormous, deliberate labor into monumental infrastructure. And yet the ancestral Puebloans who built this network had no wheeled vehicles and kept no draft or pack animals. Every one of these roads was built exclusively for people traveling on foot. This is where the puzzle sharpens considerably. A 30-foot wide road, engineered to a rigid standard of straightness and consistency, is an extraordinary investment of labor for a population moving entirely on foot, carrying goods on their own backs. Practical foot traffic simply does not require this degree of width, precision, or resistance to the terrain's natural obstacles. A narrower, winding path following the landscape's easier contours would have served basic transportation needs with a fraction of the effort. Why, then, build roads at this scale and to this exacting standard? Was practical transportation ever truly the primary purpose at all? Or was something else being expressed through the very act of construction? Mainstream archaeology has largely converged on an explanation that treats the roads as serving multiple, overlapping functions simultaneously, with ceremony and symbolism likely as central as, or more central than, practical transit. The rigid straightness of many segments, cutting through terrain a purely functional path would have avoided, suggests the roads were meant to visually and physically connect specific points, quite possibly for reasons rooted in cosmology rather than convenience. Aligning outlying great houses to the ceremonial center at Chaco along sightlines meant to be understood symbolically, a network expressing political and spiritual unity across the San Juan Basin as much as it enabled the movement of goods, pilgrims, or people between communities. Under this framework, the roads become a kind of monumental statement inscribed directly onto the land itself. Infrastructure as ideology, built to be understood as much as used. But this explanation, however well supported, leaves harder questions only partially answered. Excavation along many road segments has produced comparatively little evidence of heavy or sustained use. None of the wear patterns, refuse accumulation, or associated small site development one might expect along corridors central to regular trade and travel. Some of the most elaborately engineered segments appear to lead toward features with no obvious settlement or great house at their terminus at all. Roads that seem to end at a specific point on the landscape, a particular rock formation, a spring, or simply an unremarkable stretch of mesa, for reasons that remain entirely unclear. What was being connected to what in cases where the destination itself defies easy explanation? Were some roads built not to connect two settlements, but to connect a settlement to a sacred place whose significance we can no longer recover? The most debated proposal concerns the road's relationship to astronomy and cosmology at a scale beyond the individual building alignments already documented within Chaco Canyon itself. Several researchers have argued that certain road segments align with cardinal directions or specific celestial events with a precision unlikely to be coincidental, suggesting the entire road network may encode a broader cosmological map. The physical landscape reorganized to reflect Chacoan understanding of the cosmos, with great houses and roads together forming components of a system whose full logic operated at a scale no single building or road segment could reveal on its own. As with similar large-scale alignment claims examined elsewhere in this series, this proposal remains genuinely contested. Compelling to some researchers given the consistency of certain alignments across multiple, independently studied segments, and treated with caution by others who note that a landscape crossed by enough roads will inevitably produce some statistically expected alignments by chance alone. What is not contested is the scale of ambition the roads represent, and how little of that ambition has been fully explained. LIDAR surveys conducted in recent years continue to reveal previously unmapped road segments beneath vegetation and modern development, suggesting the known network remains incomplete even now, nearly a century after the first roads were identified from the air. Somewhere beneath the sagebrush and juniper of the San Juan Basin, additional segments almost certainly wait to be found, connecting points on the landscape whose significance to Chacoan builders has not yet been rediscovered by anyone walking that ground today. A road, by its nature, implies a destination. Someone meant to arrive somewhere, for a reason clear enough to justify the effort of the journey. What then do we make of a network of roads engineered with such extraordinary care, so many of which appear to have carried so little ordinary traffic at all? Were these paths built for the rare, extraordinary movement of pilgrims and ceremony rather than daily life? And if so, how many people, across 3 centuries of Chacoan influence, ever actually walked the roads built with such evident purpose to guide them somewhere? A road can carry a pilgrim toward the sacred. Salt, it turns out, carried entire economies toward it instead. Beneath the cypress and live oak of southern Louisiana, on a low salt dome rising unexpectedly from the flat coastal plain, lies one of the least publicized and most quietly astonishing archaeological finds in North America. Evidence that people were mining and boiling salt here more than 3,000 years ago, using technology and organization that, by the standards of the time, should not have existed yet at all. The site is Avery Island, one of several salt domes scattered across the Louisiana coast, formed by ancient deposits of rock salt pushed slowly toward the surface over millions of years. Beginning in the 1980s, archaeological excavation here uncovered something unexpected beneath the island's soil. Extensive deposits of fired clay vessel fragments, along with the remains of hearths and processing areas, associated with radiocarbon dates stretching back to at least 1500 BC and possibly earlier. This places large-scale salt production at Avery Island firmly within what archaeologists call the Poverty Point era, named for the massive earthwork complex located roughly 100 miles to the north, itself one of the most sophisticated hunter-gatherer societies documented anywhere in the ancient world, built without agriculture as its economic foundation, a rarity among societies capable of monumental construction. What makes the salt-making evidence at Avery Island so puzzling is not the presence of salt production itself. Humans have processed salt from natural sources for millennia across the globe, but the sheer scale and apparent organization behind it, at a depth in time when the surrounding region's societies are generally understood to have been small, mobile, and only lightly hierarchical. Producing usable salt from brine or rock deposits at this scale required sustained specialized labor. Boiling large quantities of brine in fired clay vessels over an extended period to concentrate and crystallize the salt, a process demanding fuel, vessels manufactured specifically for this purpose, and a workforce coordinated well beyond the scale of a single family or small band. Why would a hunter-gatherer society, without agriculture, without permanent large-scale settlement in the immediate area, organize labor at this level for a single mineral resource? What was salt worth to a late archaic society that it justified this degree of specialized, sustained industrial effort? The answer mainstream archaeology offers points toward trade. Salt does not occur everywhere, but the need for it is universal, essential not only for human consumption, but for preserving meat and fish, a critical technology for any society managing surplus food across seasons. Sites bearing material connections to the Poverty Point trade sphere, exotic stone, copper, and other non-local goods have been recovered at locations hundreds of miles from their points of origin. Evidence of an exchange network spanning much of the Mississippian Gulf Coast region even at this early date, centuries before the later Cahokia and Mississippian trade systems discussed earlier in this exploration. Under this framework, Avery Island's salt was never merely a local resource. It was a commodity, produced deliberately for exchange, flowing outward along the same rivers and trails that carried stone tools and ornamental goods into the heart of the continent. Salt production at this scale, in other words, may represent some of the earliest evidence of specialized, trade-oriented economic activity in North American prehistory, a discovery that quietly reshapes assumptions about how early and how sophisticated regional economies in the Americas could become, long before agriculture or centralized political authority took hold. This explanation is well supported by the trade evidence, but it does not fully resolve every detail the site presents. The volume of fired clay vessel fragments recovered at Avery Island and related salt processing sites along the Gulf Coast suggest production continuing across many generations, at a scale that appears, by some estimates, to exceed what regional demand for food preservation and basic trade would obviously require. Was salt production here driven by economic necessity alone, or did salt carry additional significance, ceremonial, medicinal, or symbolic, that elevated its importance beyond simple utility? Salt holds deep ritual significance in the oral traditions and practices of numerous indigenous nations across North America, most famously documented in the ongoing sacred status of the Zuni Salt Lake in western New Mexico, a site still considered profoundly holy by multiple Pueblo nations, and the Zuni people specifically, tied to origin narratives and pilgrimage practice that continue into the present day. Might the deep roots of that reverence for salt as sacred, rather than merely practical, extend back further than the written and ethnographic record can directly confirm, with the industrial-scale production at Avery Island representing not just an economic enterprise, but an early expression of that same reverence, manifested through labor rather than pilgrimage. There is a further layer to the mystery worth sitting with. Production at Avery Island and comparable Gulf Coast salt sites appears to decline and eventually cease well before the Poverty Point culture's own broader decline around 1100 BC, for reasons the archaeological record has not clearly established. Did shifting trade routes render the site less central? Its role in a wider network absorbed elsewhere as political and economic centers of gravity moved? Did environmental change, flooding, changing coastal salinity, or the shifting course of nearby waterways over centuries, disrupt access to the brine sources that sustained production? Or did the knowledge itself, the specialized techniques required to produce salt at this scale, simply fail to transmit fully to the generations that followed, an industrial capability quietly lost even as the broader society that once supported it persisted for a time in other forms? What survives today are the fragments themselves, thousands of pieces of fired clay, the residue of boiling vessels used and discarded across centuries, embedded in the soil of a salt dome that rises, still slightly improbably, from the flat Louisiana coastline. They represent one of the earliest known instances of specialized, large-scale resource industry in North American prehistory, undertaken by a society archaeologists once assumed incapable of this degree of economic complexity. The salt they produced is long since dissolved back into rain and river, carried away centuries ago along trade routes whose full extent may never be completely mapped. What did that salt purchase in the wider economy of the ancient Gulf Coast? And how much further back does the human relationship with this single, essential mineral actually reach, waiting still beneath domes and deposits no archaeologist has yet had reason to dig? Salt drew people to the coast for what the body required to survive. Water, in its purest and most concentrated form, drew them somewhere else entirely, toward what the spirit, by their own understanding, required to endure. Scattered across the Mississippian world, in limestone country stretching from present-day Tennessee and Kentucky through Alabama and Georgia. A particular category of sacred site recurs again and again in the archaeological and ethnohistoric record. Springs, sinkholes, and cave pools, treated not as sources of drinking water alone, but as thresholds, places where the Mississippian religious elite appear to have conducted some of their most significant and least understood ceremonies. The broader religious framework these springs belong to is well documented, even if its finer details remain elusive. Archaeologists refer to it as the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, sometimes called the Southern Cult, a widely shared iconographic and ritual tradition that spread across Mississippian societies roughly between 1200 and 1500, evidenced by strikingly similar symbolic motifs recovered from sites hundreds of miles apart. Raptor and serpent imagery, weeping eye designs, and ceremonial objects crafted from copper, shell, and stone, often concentrated in the burials of individuals archaeologists interpret as religious specialists or ranking priests. Central to much of this tradition's practice, according to both archaeological evidence and ethnohistoric accounts recorded from descendant Muscogean-speaking peoples, was the ritual and purifying significance of water, most famously preserved in the green corn ceremony and its associated purification rites, in which fasting, ritual bathing, and the consumption of a caffeinated ceremonial beverage, often called the black drink, played a central role in seasonal renewal and spiritual cleansing. Springs and sinkhole caves fit into this broader water-centered cosmology in a way that goes beyond simple ceremonial bathing. Excavations at cave and sinkhole sites across the Mississippian Southeast, including painted cave sanctuaries in Tennessee bearing sophisticated mud glyph artwork, created by artists working deep underground by torchlight, far beyond any natural light source, have recovered evidence of deliberate ritual activity conducted in total darkness, in chambers requiring difficult, sometimes dangerous passage to reach at all. Why travel so far into the earth past any practical necessity to conduct ceremony specifically at the water's edge in total darkness, rather than at a more accessible spring nearer the surface? What did the darkness itself contribute to the ritual that daylight could not? Mainstream interpretation, drawing on a substantial body of comparative religious and ethnohistoric evidence, situates these underground water sites within a widespread Mississippian cosmology, dividing the universe into an upper world, a middle world inhabited by the living, and an underworld associated with water, caves, and the realm of the dead, a threefold structure echoed in the iconography of the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex itself, where sky-associated raptors and water-associated serpents appear as recurring, opposed symbolic forces. Under this framework, entering a cave spring was not incidental to ritual. It was the ritual's essential geography, a physical descent into the underworld itself, undertaken by religious specialists whose authority derived, at least in part, from their capacity to safely cross that threshold and return. The priests who conducted these ceremonies were not merely performing symbolic acts near water. They were understood, within their own cosmology, to be entering it. This explanation carries real interpretive weight, but it leaves specific, harder questions only partially resolved. Many of these sacred springs and sinkholes show evidence of sustained ritual use across generations, yet a significant number appear to have been deliberately, permanently sealed or abandoned well before Mississippian societies themselves went into broader decline, following European contact and the epidemic disease that preceded and accompanied it. What determined when a sacred spring's active ceremonial life ended? Was closure a response to a specific event, a flood that altered the site, a shift in political or religious authority among the communities who maintained it, or a ceremonial retirement enacted deliberately once the site's purpose had, in the understanding of its priests, been fulfilled? The pattern echoes the deliberate sealing of Kivas at Aztec ruins and the intentional burning of outlying Hohokam villages discussed earlier in this exploration, a recurring theme across strikingly different indigenous traditions and regions, in which sacred spaces were not simply forgotten, but formally, deliberately closed. Compounding the mystery is the matter of what, precisely, was placed into these waters and why. Ritual offerings recovered from spring and sinkhole contexts across the Mississippian southeast include finely worked shell gorgets, copper ornaments, and ceremonial objects far too elaborate and valuable to have been lost by accident. Deliberate deposits, offered to water that would swallow them permanently, beyond any hope of retrieval. What was being exchanged in that offering? Some researchers interpret these deposits as a form of ceremonial reciprocity, gifts given to the underworld in exchange for the fertility, rain, or spiritual protection that world was believed to govern. Others note the frequent association of these offerings with individuals of apparently high status, raising the possibility that access to the deepest, most dangerous ceremonial water sites, and the right to make offerings there, was itself a closely guarded privilege, restricted to a religious elite whose authority depended partly on maintaining exclusive access to these thresholds. A smaller number of sites have produced something more difficult to interpret with confidence. Human remains recovered from deep cave spring contexts, in circumstances that resist easy explanation as either accidental drowning or conventional burial. Were these the remains of priests themselves, interred deliberately at the very threshold their office was believed to guard? A final descent into the underworld they had spent their lives ritually crossing and returning from. Or does this evidence point toward practices more difficult to reconstruct with confidence from material remains alone, involving methods that oral tradition, disrupted by the same forces of disease, displacement, and cultural rupture that ended so much else in this era, no longer fully preserves? The caves themselves offer no clarification. They preserve only the physical fact of presence, never the ceremony's full intention. What remains, sealed in limestone darkness across a region stretching from Tennessee to the Gulf, are springs and sinkholes that once anchored an entire religious cosmology, tended by specialists whose authority came, in part, from their willingness to descend where others would not follow. Some of these sites have been mapped and studied. Many almost certainly have not, hidden within cave systems that remain, even now, only partially explored. How many more thresholds between the middle world and the underworld still wait, undiscovered, beneath the Mississippian southeast? And what offerings, placed by priests whose names did not survive them, still rest exactly where the water was trusted to keep them forever? A sacred spring conceals its mysteries beneath water and stone. A single boulder, sitting exposed in open daylight in the Blue Ridge foothills of western North Carolina, conceals its mystery in plain sight instead. A mystery so dense and so resistant to translation that, after more than a century of dedicated study, no one has yet produced a reading of it that scholars broadly accept. The stone is known as Judaculla rock, a large outcrop of soapstone in the Caney Fork Valley of Jackson County. Its sloped surface covered in an estimated 1,500 to 1,900 individual carved marks, one of the densest concentrations of prehistoric petroglyphs found anywhere in the eastern United States. Spirals, human and animal-like figures, cupules, connected lines, and abstract geometric shapes overlap and intersect across the rock's surface in a composition so intricate that even counting the individual carvings has proven difficult, with successive surveys over the decades arriving at different totals depending on methodology and the shifting visibility of weathered marks under different light conditions. Dating the carvings precisely has proven nearly as difficult as reading them. Soapstone, unlike organic material, cannot be radiocarbon dated directly, and the rock shows evidence of carving activity added across what appears to be a very long span of time, possibly spanning centuries, by multiple hands using different techniques and working, it seems, without any obligation to preserve the compositions that came before them. Some researchers have proposed origins reaching back 3,000 years or more, tied to the broader tradition of soapstone working documented among late Archaic and Woodland period peoples across the southern Appalachians, who are well known to have quarried this same soft, workable stone extensively for vessels and other objects. Others argue for significant carving activity considerably more recent, potentially continuing into the era of documented Cherokee presence in the region. The honest answer, according to most researchers who have studied the site closely, is that Judaculla rock likely represents not a single act of creation, but an accumulated one, a surface returned to repeatedly by different people, across a span of time longer than any single oral tradition could be expected to fully preserve. The rock's name comes directly from that oral tradition. In Cherokee tradition, the site is associated with Sul-Kalu, anglicized as Judaculla, a giant, slant-eyed figure of immense power said to have leapt from the surrounding mountains onto the rock's surface, leaving behind marks in the stone as evidence of his passage. Cherokee accounts describe Judaculla as a guardian of game animals and a figure of considerable supernatural authority, associated with the surrounding mountain landscape, and, in some versions of the tradition, with a role in shaping or maintaining the balance of the natural world. This origin narrative offers something the many other mysteries explored in this series often lack entirely: a living, documented interpretive framework, preserved and maintained by descendant communities rather than reconstructed solely from archaeological inference. And yet even this framework does not fully resolve what the specific carvings depict, or why. Cherokee oral tradition explains the rock's sacred significance and its association with Judaculla convincingly, but it does not offer, at least not in any form that has been shared broadly with outside researchers, a specific translation of the individual marks themselves. What particular spiral, what particular connected line was intended to communicate on its own? Is this because such specific meaning was never the point, with the carvings functioning more as a cumulative record of sacred presence and ritual activity across generations, rather than as a message meant to be decoded symbol by symbol? Or does more specific knowledge exist, held carefully within Cherokee tradition and simply not extended to the wider academic record, in keeping with the same pattern of guarded, community-held knowledge noted earlier in this exploration regarding the Kivas of Aztec ruins? Outside interpreters, largely working without access to that deeper traditional context, have proposed a wide range of readings over more than a century of study, none achieving anything close to consensus. Some early 20th century researchers attempted to read the carvings as a literal map, proposing that specific marks corresponded to trails, water sources, or notable landscape features in the surrounding valley, a theory that has found only limited support in subsequent analysis, given the difficulty of matching the rock's dense, overlapping geometry to any consistent real-world geography. Others have proposed the carvings functioned as a boundary marker or a formal record of treaty or agreement between different groups, the accumulated marks representing successive additions by different parties across time, an interpretation that would account for the composition's layered, multi-generational character without requiring a single coherent narrative to explain the whole. A further body of speculation, considerably more contested, has proposed astronomical or calendrical functions for specific elements of the carving, an interpretive approach applied, as this series has now noted at several sites, to a wide range of ancient markings across the Americas, with similarly mixed and unresolved results here. What makes Judaculla rock especially difficult among the sites explored in this series is the specific nature of its evidence. Unlike a buried kiva or a sealed spring, where absence of information stems partly from limited excavation, every mark on this rock surface has been visible, accessible, and studied continuously for well over a century, by generations of researchers equipped with increasingly sophisticated tools. 3D laser scanning conducted in recent years has revealed carvings too faint for the human eye to register reliably, adding still more marks to an already dense and uncounted total. And still, more visibility has not produced more certainty. If anything, each new scan complicates the picture further, revealing additional layers of carving activity that only deepen the question of how many separate hands, across how many separate generations, contributed to what we now see as a single, overwhelming composition. Judaculla rock sits today behind a low protective fence in a quiet valley, visited by a fraction of the attention paid to more famous sites elsewhere on the continent. Its surface still catching raking afternoon light, in a way that makes carvings appear and disappear depending on the hour. Somewhere within those 1,500 marks, made across what may be 3,000 years by people who shared no common era, no common language beyond what oral tradition alone has carried forward, may lie information about landscape, boundary, ceremony, or cosmology that has simply never been assembled into a form modern scholarship knows how to read. Was this rock ever meant to be read as a single message at all? Or is its resistance to translation, its accumulated density defying any one interpretation, precisely the point? A record of sacred presence too vast and too collectively made for any single reading to ever fully contain it. A single carved rock can defy translation for a century. A vanished network of outposts defies something different, not interpretation, but location itself, scattered across half a continent and never fully mapped even now. Long before Cahokia rose along the Mississippi, before the southeastern ceremonial complex spread its raptor and serpent iconography across the southeast, another web of connection had already bound much of eastern North America together for centuries. The Hopewell interaction sphere, a network of exchange, shared ceremony, and mysterious, scattered outposts that archaeologists are still working to fully trace. Centered on the river valleys of present-day Ohio, where the great geometric earthworks of sites like Newark and the Hopewell Mound group still rise from the landscape in astonishingly precise circles, squares, and octagons, the Hopewell tradition flourished roughly between 100 BC and 500. What distinguishes Hopewell from many of the other traditions explored in this series is not primarily its architecture, though that architecture is itself remarkable, but the sheer geographic reach of the materials its people gathered and exchanged. Obsidian, recovered from Hopewell ceremonial contexts in Ohio, has been traced, through chemical sourcing analysis, to Yellowstone, more than 1,000 miles to the west. Copper originated from the Great Lakes. Shark teeth and marine shell arrived from the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic seaboard. Mica came from the southern Appalachians. This was not casual, occasional contact. This was a sustained, continent-spanning system of acquisition, apparently organized specifically around gathering exotic, symbolically significant materials from an extraordinary range of distant sources and concentrating them at ceremonial centers in Ohio. The question this raises is immediate and difficult. How was material moved across such distances? By whom and through what physical infrastructure? Unlike the Chacoan road system explored earlier in this series, no comparable network of engineered roads has been identified connecting Ohio to Yellowstone, or to the Gulf Coast, or to the Great Lakes. The movement of Hopewell trade goods across these distances must have relied on river routes, established trails, and a chain of intermediary contacts and way stations, sites where travelers, traders, or ceremonial pilgrims could pause, exchange goods, and continue onward. Archaeologists have long inferred that such outposts must have existed. The difficulty has been finding them. A small number of secondary Hopewell-related sites have been identified well outside the Ohio core, offering tantalizing glimpses of this wider network in action. Sites in Illinois, such as those in the lower Illinois River Valley, show clear, Hopewell-associated ceremonial architecture and material culture, suggesting genuine outlying centers of the tradition rather than mere trade pass-through points. Isolated finds of Hopewell-style materials and artifacts have surfaced as far afield as the Kansas City area, coastal Florida, and the Canadian side of the Great Lakes, hinting at a network of contact points stretching across an almost unimaginable portion of the continent for a tradition predating the wheel, draft animals, and any form of centralized political authority spanning more than a single regional cluster of communities. But between the well-documented core in Ohio and these scattered, isolated outlying finds lies an enormous amount of geography, where the connecting infrastructure, the actual waypoints, camps, and exchange points that must have existed to move Obsidian 1,000 miles on foot and by rivercraft, remains largely unidentified. Why has so little of this connective tissue survived or been found when the endpoints of the network are so clearly documented at both extremes? Several explanations compete for the answer. Many of the likely intermediary sites may have been small, seasonally occupied camps, leaving an archaeological footprint too faint and too easily destroyed by subsequent land use, erosion, and 19th and 20th century agricultural development to survive in recoverable form. River valleys, the most likely transportation corridors for this kind of exchange, have also been among the most heavily disturbed landscapes in North America, repeatedly flooded, farmed, and built over in the centuries since Hopewell's decline, potentially erasing physical evidence that once existed in far greater quantity than what survives to be excavated today. There is also a structural possibility that reframes the entire question. Perhaps the notion of fixed, permanent trade outposts is itself the wrong model for understanding how the Hopewell network functioned. Some researchers have proposed that the movement of exotic materials across such distances may have depended less on established, repeatedly used way stations, and more on down-the-line exchange, passed hand-to-hand between neighboring groups who each moved goods only a relatively short distance before passing them further along a chain extending, ultimately, across 1,000 miles or more. A system requiring no permanent outposts at all. Only a shared understanding of value and exchange sustained across many independent, only loosely connected communities. Under this model, the absence of clear intermediary sites is not a gap in the archaeological record waiting to be filled, but an accurate reflection of how the system actually worked, with no single group ever needing to travel the network's full length. The competing possibility, favored by other researchers, points to specific evidence suggesting at least some direct, long-distance travel did occur. The presence of Hopewell-style ceremonial objects and mortuary practices at outlying sites like those in Illinois and Kansas suggests something closer to shared religious participation across distance, rather than goods alone passing anonymously from hand to hand. If specific individuals, likely religious specialists or pilgrims tied to Hopewell ceremonial practice, were making at least portions of these journeys directly, then genuine waypoints, however ephemeral, would have been necessary. Camps and shelters used repeatedly enough to leave some trace, even if that trace has proven exceptionally difficult to distinguish from the countless other small, temporary sites left behind by mobile populations across this same broad region and era. Compounding the mystery further is the tradition's eventual decline. By around 500, the elaborate earthwork construction, long-distance material acquisition, and associated ceremonial practices that define the Hopewell interaction sphere had largely ceased across the core Ohio region, giving way to smaller-scale, more regionally contained societies in the centuries that followed. What caused a network spanning so much of a continent, sustained for 4 centuries, to contract so significantly? Was it a gradual loss of the shared ceremonial ideology that had once made acquiring obsidian from Yellowstone or shark teeth from the Gulf worth the effort of a network stretching so far? Or did the connective infrastructure itself, however it functioned, whatever form its waypoints actually took, simply become unsustainable, its long chains of exchange finally breaking under pressures the archaeological record has not yet clearly identified? What remains are the endpoints. The geometric earthworks of Ohio, precise and monumental, and the scattered isolated finds 1,000 miles distant that prove, beyond doubt, that something once connected them. Between those 2 points lies an enormous, largely unmapped expanse where the actual mechanics of that connection, the camps, the trails, the hands that carried obsidian and copper and shell across a continent on foot, remain almost entirely unrecovered. How much of that vanished infrastructure still waits beneath river silt and farmland, unexcavated simply because no one has yet known precisely where along that 1,000-mile chain to dig? A vanished trade network leaves its evidence in what traveled between 2 fixed points. A different kind of Midwestern mystery leaves its evidence in shapes that never moved at all. Vast figures laid out directly across the prairie, built not from earth mounded upward, but from stone arranged flat against the ground, visible in full only from a vantage point their builders could never have occupied. Scattered across the glacial prairies and river bluffs of present-day Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas, these are the Boulder effigies of the upper Midwest, a lesser-known cousin to the region's famous earthen effigy mounds, and, in many ways, a more perplexing one still. The effigy mounds of Wisconsin, built by late woodland peoples roughly between 700 and 1200, are relatively well documented. Raised earthen shapes depicting birds, bears, panthers, and other forms, constructed at a scale meant to be appreciated at least partially from the ground, often associated with burial practice and interpreted as expressions of clan identity or cosmological belief tied to sky, earth, and water divisions common across many woodland and later indigenous traditions. Boulder effigies operate on a related but distinct principle. Rather than building shapes upward from mounded soil, their builders arranged individual stones, collected, carried, and set with deliberate care, directly onto the prairie surface, outlining figures that can stretch well over 100 feet in length. Human forms with outstretched limbs, turtles, birds, and, in a handful of remarkable cases, serpentine figures winding for hundreds of feet across open ground. The most famous surviving example, the Great Serpent effigy near Sioux Falls in South Dakota, sometimes called Dinosaur Park's namesake predecessor, though it long predates that later development, extends for well over 300 feet, its sinuous form composed of quartzite boulders laid end-to-end across a hilltop overlooking the Big Sioux River. Similar boulder outlines, though generally smaller and less completely preserved, have been documented across Iowa's Los Hills and scattered locations throughout Minnesota and the Dakotas, their survival owed largely to the fact that stone, unlike raised earth, resists agricultural leveling and erosion far more effectively, meaning boulder effigies that have survived intact into the present likely represent only a fraction of what once existed across a prairie landscape that has since been extensively plowed, farmed, and developed for well over a century. That survival bias is itself the first layer of this mystery. If stone effigies endure so much better than their earthen counterparts, and yet only a modest number have been documented compared to the hundreds of known earthen mounds in the same broader region, does that indicate boulder effigies were always comparatively rare, a specialized or localized tradition practiced by specific communities rather than a widespread one? Or does it suggest the opposite? That a once much larger tradition has simply gone unrecognized, its scattered stone outlines mistaken for natural glacial debris, disturbed by farming before their deliberate arrangement was ever noticed, or quietly destroyed by landowners unaware they were looking at anything other than an inconvenient stone field. Dating these structures precisely compounds the difficulty considerably. Unlike earthen mounds, which frequently contain organic material, artifacts, or burials that can be radiocarbon dated with reasonable confidence, boulder effigies typically yield very little datable material at all. The stones themselves are ancient glacial erratics, deposited by ice sheets thousands of years before any human arrangement, meaning the rock's own age tells researchers nothing about when it was moved into position. Age estimates for most boulder effigies therefore rely on indirect evidence, associated artifacts found nearby, stylistic comparison to better dated earthen effigies, and, in some cases, oral tradition recorded from descendant Dakota, Iowa, and other regional indigenous communities. This leaves many boulder effigies with only broad, uncertain date ranges, some potentially predating the late woodland earthen effigy tradition considerably, others possibly overlapping with or even postdating it, a chronological picture considerably less resolved than for almost any other site type explored in this series. Ethnohistoric and oral accounts from Dakota and other regional nations do preserve associations for at least some of these sites, connecting particular effigies to origin narratives, ceremonial practice, or specific culture hero figures tied to the surrounding landscape. Context that, as with Judaculla rock, offers a genuine interpretive foundation grounded in living tradition rather than pure archaeological speculation. But as with that earlier site, this traditional knowledge does not always extend to explaining every individual effigy in the detail outside researchers would need to fully reconstruct each figure's specific purpose, particularly for the many smaller, more fragmentary boulder outlines scattered in isolated locations far from any well-documented ceremonial center. The human form effigies raise a particular question that has drawn sustained attention. Several documented examples depict figures with unusual proportions, elongated limbs, or additional appendages that some early researchers interpreted, likely too literally, as depictions of unusual or supernatural beings rather than stylized representations of ordinary human or ancestral figures. Most contemporary archaeologists caution against reading these proportional distortions too literally, noting that stylization, symbolic exaggeration, and constraints imposed by the practical difficulty of arranging heavy stones into precise anatomical proportion could all account for figures that depart from strict realism without requiring any exotic explanation. And yet the persistent recurrence of certain unusual features across multiple, geographically separated sites has kept the question from fully closing. Are these simply the natural result of independent artistic convention repeated across a shared cultural tradition? Or does the consistency point toward something more specific and intentional being depicted again and again, across considerable distance, by builders working from a shared understanding we no longer fully possess? Perhaps most striking is the deliberate placement of many boulder effigies on elevated, highly visible terrain, hilltops and bluff edges overlooking river valleys, positioned for maximum visibility from below. A design choice that appears, unlike some of the ground-level Mojave alignments explored earlier in this series, to have prioritized being seen rather than only being walked or ritually approached. Who was meant to see these figures from the valley floor, and what were they meant to understand upon seeing them? A territorial marker, a spiritual guardian watching over the river below, or a monument meant simply to be recognized by anyone passing through, regardless of their specific relationship to the community that built it. What remains across the upper Midwest's prairies and bluff tops are a scattered handful of these stone figures, survivors of a tradition that stone has preserved far better than the landscape's own historical memory of it. Each surviving effigy is a deliberate arrangement, boulder by boulder, of a shape someone considered important enough to build, at a scale meant to be seen from below, and remembered for generations after. How many more once stood on hilltops now leveled for farmland, their stones scattered or buried decades before anyone thought to ask what shape they had once formed together. A boulder effigy waits on a hilltop to be seen from below. A fish weir waits somewhere else entirely, buried beneath the very water it was built to work with, invisible for most of the year, surfacing only when conditions align precisely enough to reveal what has been hiding in plain sight all along. In 1913, construction workers excavating for a new subway line beneath Boylston Street in downtown Boston uncovered something that stopped the project cold. Thousands of wooden stakes driven upright into what had once been tidal mud flats, arranged in patterns that made no sense as random debris. They had found what would become known as the Boylston Street Fish Weir, and with it, one of the oldest and most quietly remarkable engineering mysteries in New England. A fish weir, in its basic principle, is simple: a fence-like structure built across a tidal flat, river channel, or estuary mouth, designed to trap fish as water recedes, allowing people to harvest large quantities efficiently without the need for individual line or spearfishing. What made the Boylston Street discovery extraordinary was not the concept, well documented among indigenous peoples across the Northeast at the time of European contact, but the scale, sophistication, and age of what had been buried beneath the city. Radiocarbon dating eventually placed the earliest phases of construction at an astonishing 5,200 years before present, with evidence of continued use and rebuilding across a span of well over 2,000 years afterward, meaning the structure was already ancient by the standards of many other sites explored in this series, before its builders' more famous Woodland-era descendants had even begun constructing the earthworks and effigy mounds discussed earlier. The engineering itself, once properly studied, proved more sophisticated than the simple fence-like structure the concept initially suggests. Excavators recovered an estimated 65,000 wooden stakes across the full excavated area, driven into the mudflat in a pattern too dense and too consistent to represent casual or incidental fishing activity. This was systematic, large-scale infrastructure, maintained and rebuilt repeatedly across an almost unimaginable span of generations, adapting as sea level rose gradually around it, and the tidal flat's exact contours shifted over the centuries. What does it mean for a single piece of communal infrastructure to remain in continuous, adapted use for 2,000 years? Few structures anywhere in the world, built by any society, maintain functional continuity across a time span that long, particularly among populations without centralized political authority spanning more than individual communities. This longevity is where the mystery deepens considerably. Sustaining a single fishing structure across 2 millennia requires more than a good initial design. It requires transmitted knowledge, precise understanding of tidal patterns, fish migration timing, wood selection and preservation techniques suited to a saltwater tidal environment, and the coordinated seasonal labor of a community willing to maintain and rebuild the structure, generation after generation, likely well beyond the memory of whoever first drove stakes into that mudflat 5,000 years ago. How was this knowledge preserved and transmitted across such an extraordinary span of time, in a society that left no writing? What social or ceremonial framework existed around a structure this central to a community's food security, ensuring that the specific technical knowledge required to maintain it did not simply erode or get lost across 200 generations? Mainstream archaeology situates the Boylston Street Weir, and comparable though generally smaller and less thoroughly studied weir sites documented elsewhere along the New England and Canadian maritime coastline. within a broader pattern of sophisticated, sustainable resource management practiced by indigenous coastal communities across the Northeast for millennia before European contact. Communities whose economies, contrary to older assumptions of simple, opportunistic subsistence, are increasingly understood to have involved substantial planning, seasonal scheduling, and large-scale communal infrastructure investment, comparable in its own way to the agricultural and architectural achievements documented at inland sites throughout this series. Under this framework, the Weirs' longevity reflects not mystery so much as successful, sustained cultural practice, a structure so effectively integrated into seasonal life and knowledge transmission that it simply continued working, generation after generation, precisely as designed. This explanation accounts for the structure's basic persistence, but leaves specific, harder details still unresolved. The stake patterns recovered at Boylston Street show clear evidence of multiple distinct construction phases, with orientation and design shifting somewhat across the structure's long history. Changes that likely reflect adaptation to a slowly changing shoreline, as post-glacial sea levels continued rising throughout this period, gradually submerging what had once been dry land beneath the harbor that exists today. But do all the observed changes in the Weirs' design reflect purely practical, environmental adaptation, or do some reflect shifts in the identity, practice, or even the specific community responsible for maintaining the structure across such an enormous span of time? 2,000 years is long enough to have encompassed the rise and fall of entirely distinct cultural traditions elsewhere in North America, evidenced throughout this series. Is it plausible that a single fishing site remained under continuous care by essentially one unbroken cultural tradition for that entire span, or more likely that stewardship of the Weir past, at some point or points now invisible in the archaeological record, from one community or tradition to another, the physical structure outlasting the specific people who first conceived it? There is also the matter of how much of this larger picture remains unexcavated. The Boylston Street Weir was uncovered entirely by chance, during subway construction in a rapidly developing early 20th century city, and only a fraction of the original tidal flat has ever been systematically excavated. Much of the structure's full extent almost certainly remains sealed beneath modern Boston streets and foundations, inaccessible to further study without disruption on a scale no city would readily permit. Comparable Weir sites elsewhere along the New England coastline, similarly buried beneath centuries of subsequent land use, coastal development, and rising sea levels, likely remain entirely undiscovered, their existence unsuspected, simply because no construction project has yet happened to intersect with them the way the Boylston Street subway line did in 1913. What survives, preserved today largely in museum collections and archival photographs rather than in the ground itself, is evidence of a structure that functioned continuously for longer than the entire span separating the present day from the earliest Egyptian pyramids, built, rebuilt, and maintained by generations of people whose names, specific cultural identities across that vast stretch of time, and precise methods of knowledge transmission remain largely unrecoverable from the wooden stakes alone. How does a single piece of practical infrastructure outlast nearly every other form of cultural memory associated with it, surviving in mud and silt, while the language, names, and specific stories of the people who built and maintained it across 2,000 years have gone almost entirely silent? And what other structures, just as old, just as patiently maintained across generations we will never identify, still wait beneath the harbors and tidal flats of the New England coast for the right construction project to accidentally bring them back into the light? A fish weir survives because water conceals it. On Florida's southwestern coast, an entirely different kind of survival took place, not concealment, but sheer accumulation. Entire islands built deliberately from shell, mud, and bone, engineered by a society that grew powerful, complex, and militarily dominant without ever adopting agriculture at all. This is Mound Key, rising from the shallow waters of Estero Bay near present-day Fort Myers, and it was once the capital of one of the most formidable and least understood civilizations in pre-contact North America, the Calusa. When Spanish explorers first made sustained contact with the Calusa in the 16th century, they encountered something that did not fit their expectations of the peoples they had already met elsewhere in the Americas. The Calusa maintained no farmland, growing no maize, beans, or squash in a region where agriculture was entirely possible. Instead, their entire economic and political system rested on an extraordinarily productive fishing and shellfish economy, drawn from the rich estuarine waters of the Gulf Coast, an economy so reliable and so abundant that it sustained population densities, social stratification, and centralized political authority, typically associated elsewhere only with agricultural societies. The Calusa built a paramount chiefdom that, by the time of Spanish contact, held political dominance over a wide swath of southern Florida, commanding tribute from other coastal peoples and mounting organized resistance capable of repelling early Spanish military incursions outright, including, according to Spanish accounts, contributing directly to the failure and eventual death of Juan Ponce de Leon following a Calusa attack in 1521. Mound Key itself stands as physical testament to this unusual foundation, constructed almost entirely from oyster shell, fishbone, and other shell-midden material accumulated and deliberately shaped over centuries. The island rises in places more than 30 feet above the surrounding water, its surface engineered with canals, water courts, and elevated platforms that Spanish accounts describe as supporting the residence of the Calusa's paramount chief, along with structures large enough to hold hundreds of people at once for ceremonial and political gatherings. This was not an incidental byproduct of shellfish consumption, in the way earlier interpretations once dismissed the shell rings of the Southeast, explored earlier in this series as simple waste accumulation. At Mound Key, the shell itself was clearly the primary building material of a capital city, engineered with canals cut directly through accumulated midden to allow canoe traffic to move through the settlement's interior. Infrastructure requiring the kind of centralized planning and sustained labor coordination generally associated with far more famous, agriculturally based Mississippian centers like Cahokia. The mystery here begins with a genuine anomaly in how complex societies are generally understood to develop. Conventional models of social complexity across much of world archaeology have long linked the rise of centralized political authority, monumental construction, and significant social stratification to agricultural surplus, the theory being that farming, and the storable surplus it makes possible, provides the economic foundation necessary to support specialists, elites, and large-scale construction projects not directly engaged in food production. The Calusa built exactly this kind of complex, stratified, monumentally capable society, without agriculture playing any significant role at all, relying instead on the sustained, high-yield productivity of Gulf Coast fisheries and shellfish beds. How, precisely, did a fishing economy generate surplus reliable and abundant enough to sustain this level of political and architectural complexity, when comparable, non-agricultural societies elsewhere in the world rarely achieved anything close to this scale? Was the Estero Bay estuary system simply that extraordinarily productive, its fisheries capable of supporting population densities that would require farmland almost anywhere else? Or does the Calusa case suggest that the conventional link between agriculture and complexity has been overstated more broadly, with other, less obvious paths towards social complexity waiting to be recognized at similarly overlooked coastal sites elsewhere in the world? Compounding this puzzle is how comparatively little of Calusa ceremonial and religious life has survived into the historical or archaeological record with real clarity, despite the society's obvious sophistication. Spanish missionary and colonial accounts describe Calusa religious practice only in fragments, references to multiple deities, elaborate mortuary customs, and ceremonies conducted by religious specialists whose full role and authority, the Spanish observers, writing from a position of considerable cultural distance and evident hostility toward practices they did not understand or respect, recorded only partially and often dismissively. Archaeological excavation at Mound Key and related Calusa sites has recovered wooden ceremonial objects, remarkably preserved by the anaerobic, waterlogged conditions of the surrounding mud, carved masks, animal effigies, and ceremonial implements of considerable artistic sophistication. But the specific ritual context and meaning behind many of these objects remains difficult to reconstruct with confidence, precisely because the society that made and used them was so thoroughly and rapidly disrupted before more detailed documentation could occur. That disruption is itself central to why so much about Calusa ceremonial life remains obscured. Unlike some of the traditions explored earlier in this series, where descendant communities today maintain living connections to ancestral practice and oral tradition, the Calusa, as a distinct political and cultural entity, did not survive the colonial era in continuous, identifiable form. Population collapse driven by European-introduced disease, combined with sustained pressure from Spanish colonization and later British Allied raids from other indigenous groups displaced by expanding colonial settlement further north, devastated Calusa communities across the 17th and early 18th centuries. By the mid-1700s, surviving Calusa populations had been dramatically reduced and dispersed, with historical accounts suggesting remnant groups eventually relocated, in some accounts as far as Cuba, their distinct political identity effectively ending as a continuous, documented presence in Florida. This means that much of what specific ceremonial objects and practices actually meant to the Calusa themselves was lost in a way considerably more complete than at sites where descendant knowledge, however fragmented, continues into the present. What remains at Mound Key and the smaller, related shell mound sites scattered across Florida's southwestern coast are the physical remnants of an extraordinary, non-agricultural civilization. Canals cut through solid shell, platforms engineered to support a paramount chief's residence, ceremonial objects preserved by chance in waterlogged mud, testifying to a religious and political life whose full meaning departed with the society that created it, largely before outside observers thought to record it in the detail later scholarship would need. How complex and how singular was the ceremonial life practiced atop these shell mounds at its height, and how much of it might still be recoverable, waiting in wood and shell beneath Florida's mangroves, if the right excavation in the right undisturbed layer of midden finally reaches it. A shell-built capital rises from Florida's coastal mud, engineered by hands whose descendants scattered beyond recovery. Further north, across the forested hills of New England and the mid-Atlantic, an entirely different kind of stone landscape survives, not concentrated in a single dramatic monument, but dispersed across tens of thousands of miles of low, dry-laid stone walls and rows, threading through woodlands that, to most hikers passing through them today, look like unremarkable remnants of old farm boundaries. For many of these structures, that assumption is almost certainly correct. For a significant and hotly debated portion of them, it may not be, and untangling which is which has become one of the most contentious questions in northeastern American archaeology. The scale of the phenomenon alone is worth sitting with. Stone walls and rows crisscross the forests of New England in numbers that some researchers estimate may exceed 250,000 miles in total length across the region. A genuinely staggering figure, larger than the distance from the Earth to the Moon, built almost entirely from stone cleared and stacked by hand without mortar, across a landscape that was, at the height of colonial-era agricultural expansion in the 18th and 19th centuries, extensively cleared for farmland before large portions of it reverted to forest in the 20th century as agriculture in the region declined. This colonial and early American context accounts for the overwhelming majority of what researchers document. Farmers clearing rocky New England soil for cultivation needed somewhere to put the stones their plows turned up season after season, and low stone walls built simply by stacking cleared field stone along property boundaries served that practical purpose efficiently across thousands of individual farms for well over 2 centuries. Most stone rows in the region, examined individually, fit this explanation without difficulty. Irregular in construction, following property lines rather than any deliberate symbolic pattern, and datable through associated artifacts, historical land records, and construction technique to the colonial and early federal periods. But not every stone row fits this pattern cleanly, and it is the exceptions that have generated sustained, serious debate rather than easy dismissal. A subset of stone structures found throughout the Northeast, including specific rows, cairns, and more elaborate constructed features, display characteristics that diverge meaningfully from what colonial-era agricultural clearing would be expected to produce. Some rows run for considerable distances through terrain that was never cleared for farming at all, crossing steep, rocky, heavily forested hillsides with no evidence of agricultural use in the surrounding area, historical or archaeological. Others incorporate deliberately balanced or perched boulders, stones set on smaller supporting stones in configurations requiring far more careful placement than simple field-clearing debris would demand. Still others include effigy-like formations, stones arranged to suggest turtle, serpent, or other animal shapes, echoing in miniature and in a very different regional tradition the Boulder effigies of the upper Midwest discussed earlier in this exploration. Why would a colonial farmer, clearing rock purely to get it out of the way of a plow, invest the additional time and care required to balance a boulder deliberately atop a smaller stone, or arrange stones into a recognizable animal form, when the practical goal of simply moving unwanted rock off farmland required no such precision at all? This is where the central controversy of northeastern stone rows takes shape, and it is worth presenting with real care, because it involves not merely competing archaeological interpretations, but competing claims to whose knowledge and authority should determine the answer. A body of research, advanced significantly over the past several decades by Indigenous researchers and organizations, most prominently the Narragansett Indian Tribal Historic Preservation Office in Rhode Island, along with allied archaeologists and the broader Northeast Ceremonial Stone Landscape research community, argues that a meaningful subset of these stone constructions were not built by colonial farmers at all, but by indigenous peoples of the region for ceremonial, spiritual, and cultural purposes, predating and, in some cases, persisting alongside European colonization. Under this framework, certain stone rows, cairns, and effigy formations represent what has come to be called ceremonial stone landscapes, sacred sites marking significant locations such as burial grounds, spiritual gathering places, or features tied to specific tribal cosmology and practice, constructed according to traditions maintained by Algonquian-speaking peoples of the Northeast across a span of time that, by some accounts, may extend back centuries or more before sustained European contact, and continued in some documented instances well into the colonial period itself. This interpretation draws support from several converging lines of evidence. Oral tradition maintained by several northeastern tribal nations describes specific stone features and their significance, identifying particular sites as ancestral, ceremonial, or otherwise culturally significant in ways that predate and exist independently of the colonial land use record. Some documented stone constructions occur in clusters or configurations that bear meaningful resemblance to ceremonial stone features documented among indigenous communities in other parts of North America, including feature types associated with astronomical observation, ceremonial gathering, and mortuary practice. And crucially, the involvement of tribal historic preservation offices in identifying and advocating for the protection of specific sites reflects a form of evidence, rooted in living cultural authority and continuity, that operates differently from, and advocates argue, deserves weight alongside, conventional archaeological dating and interpretation, particularly for site types where physical dating evidence is inherently difficult to obtain. A significant portion of the professional archaeological community, however, has approached these claims with considerable skepticism, and this disagreement has become genuinely contentious rather than a settled academic consensus in either direction. Critics of the ceremonial stone landscape framework, including a number of academic and cultural resource management archaeologists specializing in the Northeast, argue that the physical characteristics cited as evidence of indigenous ceremonial construction, irregular placement, location in non-agricultural terrain, occasional balanced or perched stones, can, in many documented cases, be explained through more mundane colonial-era activities beyond simple field clearing, including boundary marking in wooded or pastured land never intended for cultivation, livestock enclosure walls built through forest for grazing rather than farming, and stone disposal practices tied to activities like well digging, foundation construction, or road building that would not follow agricultural field boundaries at all. These critics point to the genuine difficulty of dating stone construction with any precision. Dry-stacked fieldstone, unlike structures containing organic material, offers few reliable means of direct dating, leaving interpretation heavily dependent on circumstantial evidence, construction-style comparison, and historical context that can support multiple competing readings of the same physical feature. The dispute has real practical stakes beyond academic debate, which has sharpened its intensity considerably. Sites identified as ceremonial stone landscapes have factored directly into land development, conservation, and legal disputes across New England in recent decades, with tribal historic preservation offices seeking protected status for specific stone features under state and federal historic preservation law, sometimes in direct conflict with development projects, and sometimes meeting resistance from landowners, developers, or academic archaeologists who dispute the ceremonial interpretation of the specific features in question. This has meant that determining the origin and purpose of a given stone row is, in a meaningful number of documented cases, not merely a historical curiosity, but an active legal and cultural question with consequences for whether specific pieces of land receive legal protection as culturally significant sites. What makes this genuinely difficult, rather than a simple matter of one side possessing evidence the other lacks, is that both the ceremonial and the agricultural explanations are almost certainly correct for different individual stone rows within the same broad regional phenomenon. The overwhelming physical evidence for widespread colonial-era field clearing across New England is not seriously disputed by anyone. The region's agricultural history is extensively documented, and the majority of the region's stone walls, examined individually, show clear characteristics consistent with that history. Equally, the existence of genuine indigenous stone construction traditions in the Northeast, including documented ceremonial cairns, burial markers, and other stone features with clear cultural significance independently verified through archaeological and ethno-historic evidence, is not seriously disputed either. The unresolved and contentious question is not whether either category exists, but rather how to reliably distinguish between them at the level of individual, ambiguous sites, particularly the many stone rows and formations that display characteristics not fully consistent with either straightforward agricultural clearing or clearly established ceremonial construction types. leaving them in an interpretive gray zone that neither side has been able to resolve definitively. Some specific features have drawn particular scrutiny precisely because they resist easy classification into either category. Elaborate stone chambers found scattered across New England. Small, corbelled stone structures resembling root cellars or storage chambers, some aligned with apparent precision towards solstice, sunrise, or sunset positions, have generated decades of dispute considerably more heated than that surrounding simple stone rows. Mainstream archaeological consensus generally attributes the majority of these chambers to colonial-era root cellars or storage structures, built by farmers for practical cold storage using techniques familiar from European building traditions. But the specific astronomical alignments documented at some of these chambers, along with construction techniques that some researchers argue exceed what practical root cellar function would require, have led other researchers, spanning a range from serious academic dissent to considerably more speculative territory, to argue that at least some of these structures may be considerably older, potentially tied to pre-colonial indigenous, or, in the most contested and least evidentially supported theories, pre-Columbian transatlantic contact claims that the overwhelming majority of professional archaeologists regard as unsupported by credible evidence. This series treats that most extreme category of claim with the skepticism the broader archaeological community affords it, while still noting that the underlying, more measured questions about which specific stone constructions in this region are indigenous, which are colonial, and which resist confident classification either way, remain genuinely, professionally unresolved. What this leaves across the forests and hillsides of New England and the broader Northeast woodlands is a landscape simultaneously among the most thoroughly mapped and least confidently understood in North America. Hundreds of thousands of miles of stone construction, much of it certainly colonial, some of it certainly indigenous and ceremonial, and a meaningful remainder occupying a genuinely contested space between those two categories, not due to any lack of physical evidence, but because the physical evidence itself, absent organic material to date and absent, in many specific cases, direct documentary or oral tradition tying a particular row to a particular builder, simply does not resolve the question on its own. Unlike many of the mysteries explored elsewhere in this series, where time and disrupted transmission are the primary obstacles to understanding, the obstacle here is entangled with contemporary questions of authority, evidence, and whose knowledge is weighted most heavily in reconstructing a landscape's history. A debate playing out currently in preservation offices and courtrooms as much as in academic journals. Walking through a New England forest today, following a low stone row disappearing into the trees ahead, there is often no way to know with confidence which century and which set of hands first set those stones in place, whether a farmer clearing rocky pasture 200 years ago or someone considerably earlier, marking ground considered sacred for reasons a colonial land survey was never designed to record. How many of the 250,000 miles of stone still lacing through these woods carry a history entirely different from the one most hikers, driving past them or stepping over them without a second thought? Assume they already know. A stone row can keep its secret simply by being ambiguous. A wall that might be one thing or might be another, with no clear way to tell. The mystery of Hopewell obsidian works differently. Here, remarkably, the source itself is not in doubt at all. Researchers can point to the precise volcanic cliff face, more than 1,000 miles from where the finished blades and ceremonial bifaces were ultimately buried, and say with real confidence, this is where the stone came from. And yet knowing the source has, if anything, only sharpened the deeper mystery surrounding it. At Obsidian Cliff, within what is now Yellowstone National Park in northwestern Wyoming, a large volcanic glass flow formed roughly 180,000 years ago by an eruption of the Yellowstone caldera provides some of the finest, most workable obsidian in North America. A jet-black volcanic glass capable of being worked into blades with an edge sharper, at the moment of flaking, than modern surgical steel. Beginning in the mid-20th century, archaeologists, using increasingly precise trace element sourcing techniques, and later X-ray fluorescence analysis, capable of matching a single flake's chemical signature to its exact geological point of origin, confirmed something that had long been suspected but never proven. A substantial portion of the obsidian recovered from Hopewell ceremonial sites in Ohio, more than 1,000 miles to the east, originated specifically at Obsidian Cliff. This is not a probable regional match. It is, in many documented cases, a confirmed identification down to a specific volcanic flow within a specific park boundary. The confirmation of that source, rather than closing the case, opened a considerably harder set of questions, because everything else about how that obsidian made its journey remains almost entirely unrecovered. Excavations at Hopewell. Ceremonial centers, particularly the Hopewell Mound group itself and the Turner Earthworks near Cincinnati, have produced obsidian caches of a scale that is, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. One deposit at the Hopewell site alone yielded over 300 pounds of raw and worked Yellowstone obsidian, including bifaces cut and shaped into elaborate ceremonial forms. Some finished into blades over a foot in length, ritually deposited in mortuary contexts rather than used for any practical cutting purpose their finished elegance would have compromised. To put that raw material figure in perspective, 300 pounds of obsidian, sourced from a single volcanic outcrop in what is now northwestern Wyoming, transported entirely on foot or by river craft, without draft animals, without wheeled transport, across more than 1,000 miles of forest, prairie, and river valley, to be deposited, ultimately, not as tools for daily use, but as ceremonial offerings within Ohio burial mounds. The physical journey alone raises questions this series has now encountered in several forms, but rarely at this extreme a distance. What route did this material actually travel? The most plausible geographic path would have followed a combination of overland travel and river transport, likely tracing portions of the Missouri and Mississippi river systems, or northern routes through the Great Lakes, before finally reaching the Ohio Valley via one of several possible tributary systems. But unlike the well-documented Chacoan road network explored earlier in this series, no comparable infrastructure, no engineered path, no chain of confirmed intermediate camps, has been identified connecting Yellowstone to Ohio with anything approaching the specificity researchers can offer for the roads radiating from Chaco Canyon. The obsidian's origin point is certain. Nearly every mile of the journey between that point and its final ceremonial deposit remains, functionally, undocumented. This is where the question of lost quarries, properly understood, becomes more precise than it might first appear. Obsidian Cliff itself is not lost. It has been identified, studied, and is today a protected archaeological site within Yellowstone, with clear evidence of extensive prehistoric quarrying activities spanning thousands of years and multiple distinct cultural traditions well beyond Hopewell alone. What remains genuinely unresolved is everything downstream of the quarry itself. The identity of who actually did the quarrying on Hopewell's behalf, whether Hopewell people themselves ever traveled the full distance to the source, or whether the material passed through a chain of intermediary societies inhabiting the vast geographic space between Wyoming and Ohio. Societies about whose participation in this exchange the archaeological record currently offers only fragments. Trace element sourcing studies have identified small quantities of Yellowstone region obsidian at sites scattered across a broad swath of the Great Plains and Missouri River Valley, offering tantalizing hints of intermediate points along at least one plausible route. But these scattered plain sites generally show far smaller quantities and less elaborate ceremonial treatment of the material than what has been recovered in Ohio, complicating any simple model of the plains serving as a well-established, heavily trafficked corridor. If Hopewell obsidian passed through the plains region in significant quantity on its way to Ohio, why does the intervening archaeological record not show more robust evidence of a well-worn trade corridor, comparable in scale to what the final Ohio deposits would seem to demand? Was the material moved rapidly and directly by a smaller number of specialized long-distance travelers, leaving little trace along a route they crossed quickly rather than settled? Or does the current archaeological picture simply reflect the same survey and preservation gaps that obscure the Hopewell interaction sphere's broader intermediary infrastructure, discussed earlier in this exploration, waiting on further excavation across a vast and only partially surveyed intervening landscape? There is also the deeper question of motive and meaning, which the physical evidence can only partially address. Obsidian, unlike the region's locally available flint and chert, offered no practical advantage over local materials sufficient to justify a 1,000-mile journey on purely functional grounds. Ohio, Hopewell communities had ready access to high-quality local stone, including the well-documented Flint Ridge deposits, entirely capable of producing sharp, effective tools without any need for imported material at all. This means the value of Yellowstone obsidian to Hopewell people was almost certainly symbolic and ceremonial rather than practical, its worth tied specifically to its exotic origin, its glossy, unusual black color, unlike any locally available stone, and very possibly to the difficulty and distance of its acquisition itself, functioning as a marker of status, spiritual power, or ceremonial significance precisely because of how far it had traveled and how few hands could have arranged for its journey. Under this framework, the mystery deepens rather than resolves. If the value of the material was tied specifically to the extraordinary distance and difficulty of its acquisition, what kind of individual or group possessed the knowledge, the trade relationships, and the organizational capacity to actually undertake or arrange a journey of this scale, repeatedly, across multiple generations of continued Hopewell obsidian use? Some researchers have proposed that specific religious specialists or a specialized class of long-distance traders may have existed within or alongside Hopewell society specifically to manage this kind of exchange. Individuals or small groups whose social role was defined substantially by their capacity to acquire materials from extraordinary distances, whether through direct travel, extensive trade relationships maintained across the full length of the route, or some combination of both. This would align with the broader pattern this series has traced across numerous unrelated traditions. Specialized religious or trade authority tied to control over rare, symbolically potent materials, echoing the priests who guarded access to sacred springs in the Mississippian southeast, and the communities who appear to have controlled lead glaze material along the Rio Grande. But direct evidence for such a specialized Hopewell trading or pilgrimage class remains circumstantial at best, inferred from the pattern of the material itself rather than confirmed through any burial or site directly identifying individuals in this specific role. A smaller, more speculative line of inquiry has asked whether Hopewell obsidian acquisition might have functioned, at least in part, as a kind of pilgrimage practice rather than pure economic trade. Journeys undertaken not primarily to acquire material for its market or craft value, but as a ceremonial act in itself, with the obsidian serving as physical proof of a spiritual undertaking completed, its final deposition in an Ohio mortuary context, representing not the end of a trade transaction but the completion of a ritual journey. This interpretation draws loosely on ethnographically documented pilgrimage traditions among later indigenous societies across North America. where difficult journeys to acquire specific sacred materials, certain minerals, particular plants, water from specific springs, carried spiritual significance well beyond the material's practical use. Whether this framework applies specifically to Hopewell obsidian acquisition remains, like so much of this mystery, a plausible but currently unprovable extension of a documented pattern found elsewhere, rather than a claim directly supported by evidence specific to the Ohio Hopewell sites themselves. What can be said with confidence is this: somewhere between a volcanic cliff face in northwestern Wyoming and a burial mound in the Ohio River Valley, over more than 1,000 miles, and across a stretch of centuries during which Hopewell ceremonial practice flourished, hundreds of pounds of black volcanic glass were extracted, carried, and finally deposited with evident reverence by people whose route, whose specific method of travel, and whose full motivation remain almost entirely reconstructed through inference rather than direct evidence. The source is known. Nearly everything else about the journey is not. Continued trace element analysis of scattered intermediate sites across the plains and Missouri Valley may, in time, sharpen the picture considerably, mapping a route that currently exists mostly as a plausible line drawn between two known points on a map. Until then, the Obsidian itself remains the clearest witness to a journey no one recorded, and almost no one, it seems, was ever meant to fully retrace. What would it have taken in the world as it existed 2,000 years ago to carry 300 pounds of a sacred glossy black stone across a continent? And who, exactly, made that impossible-seeming journey happen, again and again, for the better part of a century? An obsidian trail vanishes into inference somewhere between Wyoming and Ohio. Its story reconstructed from absence as much as evidence. On the storm-battered coast of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state, a very different kind of mystery survived instead, not through absence, but through sudden, catastrophic, and in the end remarkably preserving burial, sealing an entire moment of daily life beneath the earth so completely that when it finally re-emerged centuries later, it did so with an intimacy few archaeological sites anywhere in the world have ever matched. This is Ozette, a Maca village site on the remote outer coast of Washington, and the story of its rediscovery begins not with careful excavation, but with the sea itself. In the winter of 1970, a severe storm eroded a section of coastal bluff near the village, exposing wooden planks, baskets, and other perishable artifacts that should not, by ordinary archaeological expectation, have survived at all. Wood, cordage, and other organic material typically decompose within decades in most environments, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct entire ways of life from stone tools, shell, and bone alone, while the vast majority of what any society actually built and used simply rots away, unrecorded. Ozette broke that pattern entirely because of what had happened to the village roughly 2.5 centuries earlier. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis, combined with detailed geological study of the site, established that sometime around 1700, a date that has since gained remarkable corroboration from an entirely unexpected source, discussed shortly, a massive mudslide, likely triggered by heavy rainfall following an earthquake, or possibly directly associated with a major seismic event, swept down from the bluff above the village and buried a cluster of longhouses instantly, burying them under a dense, oxygen-excluding layer of wet clay and debris. What might, in almost any other circumstance, have been an unambiguous tragedy for the people living there became, unintentionally, one of the most extraordinary preservation events in North American archaeology. The anaerobic, waterlogged conditions created by the slide halted the decomposition process almost entirely, sealing wooden house planks, roof structures, woven baskets, wooden boxes, tools, and even textile fragments in a state of preservation normally reserved for far rarer and more specialized burial environments. When systematic excavation began in 1970, led by Washington State University archaeologist Richard Daugherty, working in direct, sustained partnership with the Maka tribe, a collaborative arrangement notable for its era and widely regarded today as an early and significant model for indigenous-directed archaeological research. What emerged from the mud was not a scattering of isolated artifacts, but something closer to a frozen moment. Entire cedar plank longhouses, their structural timbers still largely intact, containing thousands of items positioned essentially where their owners had left them at the moment of the slide. Woven cedar bark baskets, fishing gear, including elaborately carved wooden hooks and harpoon components, wooden boxes decorated with carved and painted designs, even textile fragments and cordage, materials that almost never survive from this period anywhere else on the continent, emerged largely intact from Ozette's protective clay. Excavators eventually recovered more than 50,000 individual artifacts from the site, an assemblage whose sheer completeness has led researchers to describe Ozette, with real justification rather than simple promotional flourish, as one of the closest things North American archaeology has to Pompeii, a community not slowly abandoned and stripped of its belongings over time, but sealed in an instant, with daily life interrupted mid-motion. The scale of what this preservation revealed goes well beyond simple artifact counts. Because organic material survived so completely, Ozette allowed researchers to reconstruct details of daily Maka life that are almost entirely invisible at sites where only stone and bone endure. Specific woodworking techniques used in constructing the massive cedar plank longhouses, the precise methods used to carve and haft composite fishing and whaling tools, evidence of textile production and clothing construction, and a detailed insight into diet and subsistence practices drawn from remarkably well-preserved plant and animal remains found still in their original household context. This is, in a very real sense, less a mystery of absence in the mode of so many sites explored throughout this series, and more a mystery of overwhelming, almost disorienting presence. An archaeological record so complete that it raises questions not about what has been lost, but about how to fully interpret what has, against every ordinary expectation, actually survived. And it is here that Ozette's most remarkable feature comes into focus. Not the artifacts themselves, but the extraordinary correspondence between what the ground revealed and what Maka oral tradition had already been saying for generations before the 1970 storm ever exposed a single plank. Maka oral history, maintained and passed down independently of any archaeological record, describes a great slide that buried part of the village at Ozette in the ancestral past, a spirit slide, remembered specifically in tribal tradition as an event of considerable consequence to the community's history. When systematic excavation confirmed both the reality and the approximate timing of exactly this kind of catastrophic burial event, it provided a rare and significant instance of oral tradition and archaeological evidence converging with real precision on a specific historical event. A convergence that stands in notable contrast to several of the sites explored earlier in this series, where oral tradition and material evidence exist in partial, sometimes strained relationship to one another, each preserving only fragments of a fuller picture neither fully completes on its own. At Ozette, the two lines of evidence essentially confirmed each other. This convergence deepened further and gained unexpected international significance through research connecting the Ozette slide to a phenomenon far beyond the Olympic Peninsula itself. Geological and historical research conducted in subsequent decades identified evidence of a massive earthquake along the Cascadia subduction zone, the fault system running along the Pacific Northwest coast, dated with considerable precision to January of 1700, based partly on tree ring analysis of ghost forests of drowned coastal trees along the Washington and Oregon coastline, and remarkably, cross-referenced against detailed written records from Japan documenting an unexplained orphan tsunami that struck the Japanese coast without any corresponding local earthquake to account for it, on a date consistent with a trans-Pacific tsunami generated by a major Cascadia rupture. This places the Ozette slide within plausible proximity to one of the best documented major seismic events in the region's deep history, raising a genuinely significant question that connects a single buried Maka village directly to an event of transoceanic geological consequence. Was the mudslide that sealed Ozette's longhouses triggered directly by this specific 1700 Cascadia earthquake, making the site not merely a remarkable preservation event in isolation, but a physical, datable marker of one specific moment in a much larger geological and human story spanning the entire Pacific Rim? Here, however, the record's exceptional clarity begins to give way to genuine, unresolved uncertainty. While the general timeframe fits, establishing definitive, direct causal proof linking the specific slide that buried Ozette's excavated longhouses to that exact January 1700 earthquake, rather than to a somewhat earlier or later, geologically unrelated slope failure, has proven difficult to confirm with full scientific certainty. Radiocarbon dating carries inherent ranges of uncertainty that make pinpointing an exact year challenging even with strong supporting evidence, and coastal bluffs like the one above Ozette are subject to slope failure from multiple possible triggers: heavy rainfall, gradual erosion, or smaller, more localized seismic activity, independent of any single specific major earthquake. Most researchers studying the site regard a connection to the 1700 Cascadia event as plausible, and given the remarkably close timing indicated by multiple lines of evidence, quite likely, but quite likely is not the same as definitively proven, and the site's excavators and subsequent researchers have generally maintained appropriate caution about closing this specific question with more certainty than the evidence fully supports. There is a further, quieter dimension to Ozette's mystery, one that speaks less to the slide's cause and more to what the buried longhouses reveal, and don't, about the community's deeper history before that catastrophic winter. Excavation confirmed that Ozette had been occupied as a Maka village for a very long span of time prior to the slide, with archaeological evidence and Maka oral tradition both indicating the site's importance as a whaling and fishing community reaching back many centuries. But the buried longhouses represent only a single, if extraordinarily detailed, cross-section of that much longer history. A snapshot from one specific winter, roughly 3 centuries deep, within a community whose occupation of this stretch of coastline very likely extends back considerably further still, into periods the anaerobic clay of a single mudslide cannot illuminate nearly as completely. What did Ozette look like, house by house and object by object, 500 years before the slide, or 1,000? The preservation event that makes this specific moment so remarkably legible is, by its very nature, silent about everything that came before and after it, leaving researchers with an almost paradoxical situation. Extraordinary clarity about one narrow slice of time, bounded tightly on both sides by the ordinary, comparatively fragmentary uncertainty that governs almost every other archaeological site explored throughout this series. The Maka tribes continued active stewardship of the Ozette collection. The site's excavated materials are held and interpreted today at the Maka Cultural and Research Center in Naya Bay, established specifically in response to the excavation and maintained under direct tribal authority, represents a notable departure from the pattern seen at several other sites in this exploration, where descendant communities exist at some remove from the interpretation and control of their own ancestral material. At Ozette, the community whose ancestors built, lived in, and were ultimately buried alongside these longhouses has remained centrally positioned in determining how that history is presented, studied and understood, a genuinely significant model for how archaeological research involving descendant Indigenous communities can proceed with their full participation and authority intact, rather than around or despite it. What survives at Ozette, then, is neither absence nor pure certainty, but something rarer and more particular. An entire moment sealed by catastrophe, preserved with a completeness archaeology almost never achieves, confirmed independently by a community's own carried memory of the event that caused it, and connected, plausibly, if not with absolute final proof, to a specific earthquake whose consequences rippled all the way across the Pacific to written records in Japan. And yet even here, where the ground has given up so much so clearly, questions remain that no amount of careful excavation of this single buried moment can fully answer. What did the centuries of Ozette life before that January night look like, generation upon generation, in a community whose full depth of history the mud has only partially, and only briefly, allowed us to see? A mudslide can seal a single winter night in perfect, legible detail. Elsewhere, in the American West, an entirely different kind of preservation took hold. Not sudden burial, but the patient, centuries-long protection offered by dry rock overhangs and sheer sandstone cliffs, where the small stone granaries built by the Fremont people still cling to canyon walls today, tucked into ledges so narrow and so precarious that modern visitors are often left wondering not what the structures held, but how anyone ever reached them at all. The Fremont culture occupied a broad and ecologically varied territory across present-day Utah and portions of surrounding states, roughly between 300 and 1300. A span overlapping considerably with the ancestral Puebloan traditions explored earlier in this series at Chaco and Aztec ruins, though the Fremont developed along a notably distinct cultural trajectory, with their own characteristic pottery styles, rock art traditions, and, most distinctively, a particular architectural signature that sets them apart from nearly every other pre-contact society examined in this exploration. Small, carefully built granaries, constructed from stone and mud mortar, tucked into cliff faces and rock alcoves at heights and in locations that seem, on first encounter, to defy practical explanation. These granaries were not large structures. Most measure only a few feet across, roughly cylindrical or rectangular in form, built with close-fitted stonework and sealed with a mud plaster coating that, remarkably, in many cases survives intact today, centuries after construction, protected by the same arid climate and overhanging rock that has preserved so much of the American Southwest's ancient architecture. Their function, in the most basic sense, is not seriously disputed. These were storage structures, built to protect harvested maize and other cultivated foods from moisture, rodents, and other threats, allowing Fremont farming communities to secure surplus food across seasons in a landscape where agricultural success could vary considerably from year to year, depending on rainfall and growing conditions. What has generated sustained, genuine puzzlement among researchers is not the granaries' basic purpose, but their placement. A significant number of Fremont granaries were built not near habitation sites in convenient, easily accessible locations, but in extraordinarily remote and difficult-to-reach positions, high on sheer cliff faces, tucked into alcoves accessible only via narrow ledges, exposed handholds, or drops that would have required real climbing skill and considerable risk to navigate, particularly while carrying loads of harvested grain. Some granaries sit in locations so precarious that modern archaeologists and park rangers documenting these sites have needed technical climbing equipment simply to reach and study them safely. A level of access difficulty that raises an immediate and difficult question. If the primary purpose of a granary is straightforward food storage, why would a farming community deliberately choose locations this dangerous and this labor-intensive to reach when far more accessible storage options, closer to their fields and living areas, were clearly available across the broader landscape they occupied. Mainstream archaeological interpretation offers several converging, non-exclusive explanations, each grounded in reasonable practical logic. Security against theft is frequently cited as a primary motivation. Stored food represented an enormously valuable resource in a subsistence economy operating without reliable market backup, and placing granaries in locations difficult for outsiders, rival groups, or even opportunistic neighbors to access and raid would have offered meaningful protection for a community's most critical seasonal reserve. Protection from animal predation offers a related, complementary explanation. Rodents, in particular, posed a persistent and serious threat to stored grain, and elevated, difficult-to-reach cliff locations would have limited animal access considerably more effectively than ground-level storage, even accounting for the additional human effort required. Climate control factors into the picture as well, since many granary locations were selected specifically for overhangs offering protection from direct rain and snow exposure, while still allowing airflow sufficient to prevent the kind of moisture buildup that would spoil stored grain. A genuine engineering consideration reflected in the careful, consistent construction techniques found across many geographically separated Fremont granary sites. These explanations account for a great deal, and few researchers dispute their basic validity as contributing factors. But they do not fully resolve the most extreme cases. The granaries positioned in locations so remote and dangerous that security, pest protection, and climate control alone seem insufficient to justify the sheer difficulty and risk involved in both construction and ongoing access. Some documented sites required builders to work from precarious rock ledges, accessible only via routes that leave no obvious sign of how regular, seasonal retrieval of stored food could have been managed safely and repeatedly across years of continued use, particularly by community members who would have included children, elders, or others less equipped for genuinely technical climbing. Why place a structure meant for regular, repeated seasonal access in a location that seems, by any practical measure, to actively work against convenient use? This gap between practical explanation and the most extreme examples has opened space for a range of additional interpretations, several with genuine scholarly support, rather than purely speculative origin. Some researchers have proposed that the most remote and difficult-to-access granaries may have served a purpose extending beyond ordinary food security into the realm of the symbolic or ceremonial, that the difficulty of access was not an unfortunate side effect to be minimized, but potentially a deliberate feature tied to concepts of sacred protection, ritual significance attached to stored seed grain specifically, or a broader cosmological framework in which certain stores, perhaps seed corn reserved specifically for the following year's planting rather than immediate consumption, warranted a level of protection and separation from daily life that ordinary granaries did not require. Under this interpretation, the most extreme, seemingly impractical granary placements may represent not simply intensified security thinking taken to an extreme, but a qualitatively different category of structure, storing a qualitatively different category of resource. Seed corn as something closer to sacred trust than mere foodstuff, deserving a location correspondingly set apart from the practical world of everyday storage and retrieval. A related line of inquiry has focused on the timing of granary construction relative to broader patterns of stress and instability across the Fremont region during the later centuries of their occupation. Some researchers have noted that the most extreme, most inaccessible granary placements appear concentrated in the later Fremont period, corresponding roughly with growing evidence of regional drought stress, population pressure, and, in some areas, signs of increased conflict or competition for resources across the broader Southwest during the 1100s and 1200s. The same broader period of climatic and social stress implicated in the decline of Chaco Canyon Aztec ruins, and other ancestral Puebloan centers discussed earlier in this series. If this timing correlation holds up under continued research, it would suggest that the most extreme granary placements may reflect a genuine escalation in perceived threat during a period of documented regional instability. Communities responding to real, rising insecurity by placing their most critical reserves in locations that, however impractical for routine access, offered the most reliable protection available against a threat environment that had measurably worsened. This interpretation does not require any exotic explanation beyond ordinary human responses to genuine escalating resource insecurity, though it does still leave open the harder question of exactly what specific threat, or combination of threats, drove communities to accept such extraordinary access costs in exchange for security. The broader disappearance of the Fremont as a distinct, identifiable culture compounds this granary mystery considerably, tying it into one of the larger unresolved questions of the pre-contact Southwest. By roughly 1300, the distinctive Fremont cultural pattern, including the characteristic granary architecture, pottery styles, and rock art traditions that define the tradition archaeologically, appears to have largely dissolved as a recognizable, continuous cultural entity, roughly contemporaneous with the broader upheaval affecting ancestral Puebloan societies across the region during this same challenging climatic period. Unlike the ancestral Puebloan case, where at least some descendant communities maintain clear, documented cultural continuity into the present through the modern Pueblo nations, the specific relationship between Fremont populations and any single, clearly identified descendant community remains considerably less certain and more actively debated among researchers, with some evidence suggesting Fremont populations may have dispersed into, merged with, or been absorbed by neighboring groups including ancestral Numic-speaking peoples who came to occupy much of the Great Basin and Colorado Plateau in subsequent centuries, though the specific mechanics and completeness of that transition remain genuinely unresolved questions rather than settled archaeological consensus. This uncertainty about Fremont cultural continuity adds a further poignant layer to the granary mystery specifically. If the granary's most extreme placements do reflect an escalating, deliberate response to worsening regional insecurity during the Fremont culture's final centuries, then these structures may represent something closer to a physical record of anxiety and adaptation in the face of mounting pressure. A society investing ever more extraordinary effort into protecting its most essential resource. Seed corn, secured against a future its builders had genuine reason to fear, was becoming less certain. In the same general era, and under many of the same climatic pressures that would ultimately see the broader Fremont cultural pattern itself dissolve into something history can no longer trace with full confidence back to any single, continuous descendant population. What survives across the canyons and cliff faces of Fremont territory today are these small, carefully sealed stone structures, clinging to rock walls in locations that still require real effort and genuine caution for modern researchers equipped with climbing gear and safety equipment to study directly. Each granary represents a considered decision made by a community balancing the practical costs of remote, difficult construction against threats, whether theft, animal predation, spoilage, or something more urgent and less fully documented, serious enough to justify that cost repeatedly, across generations of continued use. Were these truly the most extreme expression of an otherwise straightforward practical logic, pushed to its outer limit under mounting regional stress? Or does the placement of the most remote and inaccessible examples point toward a genuinely distinct category of sacred ceremonial protection this series has now traced, in different forms, across numerous unrelated traditions throughout North America? And as the Fremont themselves faded as a distinct, traceable culture sometime after 1300, what became of the specific knowledge, the particular urgency, that had driven their builders to seal seed corn into rock faces. Few humans before or since have ever willingly climbed to reach.